the iron resolve. They called it hell with the lid off. Pittsburgh, in the late 1800s, a city built on coal, smoke, and steel. This was the furnace that forged America, and it was a furnace that demanded a price, paid in blood, sweat, and bone. Into this hell walked Liam O'Connor. He wasn't looking for riches. He was running from a nightmare. Back in Ireland, a fading promise had finally broken. His father was dying, and his younger sister, Anya, was frail and starving. A landlord's eviction notice was their death sentence. Liam's iron resolve was a simple, desperate vow. Get to America, earn the coin, and send for his family. He sold his grandmother's wedding ring to buy passage in the dark, diseased hold of a coffin ship. He survived the voyage. He survived the brutal docks of Philadelphia. He had made it to the furnace. The price of steel. The mill was not a job. It was a battlefield. At the 6 a.m. shape-up, hundreds of desperate men, Irish, German, black, and Slav, were herded like cattle. The foreman, a man named Flannery, ruled by a simple, brutal tactic: divide and conquer. He set the men against each other in a bidding war for a few extra cents. He pitted the Irish against the Hunkies, or the Slavs. Liam's cousin, Seamus, warned him. He'll bid you till you're bidding your own blood. Liam saw this truth with his own eyes. He was assigned to the slag pits, working with a giant, quiet Slav named Joseph. In the pit next to them, an Irish crew was rushing. A young man named Finn slipped, and a river of molten, white-hot slag washed over his leg. It was gone, vaporized. Before Finn's screams had even stopped, Flannery pointed to a new man at the gate. "You, take his place." This was the price of steel. The price of loyalty. Liam saw the system, and he and Joseph, the man he was supposed to hate, formed an unlikely alliance. They stopped competing and started working together, a silent, efficient team. Flannery saw this, and his power was threatened. He tried to break their bond. He offered Liam a bribe. "You're white, O'Connor," he sneered. "You speak English. I'll give you a clean job, a desk job, as my spy. You just tell me who's talking union." It was the ultimate test. His own people, like his cousin Seamus, told him to take it. But Liam looked at Joseph, the man who had worked beside him, and he made his choice. No. Flannery's revenge was swift. He demoted Liam and his crew to the worst job in the mill, the freezing, pitch-black rail yard, for half the pay. It was meant to be a death sentence of labor. The letter. It was in that frozen darkness that the letter found him. It had followed him from Ireland. He couldn't read. He had to ask a Welsh union organizer, a man named Morgan, to read it to him. The news shattered his world. His father was dead. And his sister, Anya, the reason he had crossed an ocean, the reason he endured the furnace, had been taken by the parish and sent to the workhouse. A workhouse. A prison for the poor, a place where children starved, a place people went to die. Liam's iron resolve, his will to survive, turned to ash. In that moment, it was reforged into something new, something harder, something as cold and unforgiving as the steel he hauled. It was no longer about survival. It was about war. The stand. When the company issued a 10% pay cut, Liam was ready. He stood before Flannery, with Joseph on one side and his former Irish rival on the other, and said no. They walked out. For 11 days the furnaces went cold. The beast was dead. The company fought back. They starved the families. They sent in the Pinkertons, the hired guns, and with them they brought in scabs to break the strike. Liam stood on the picket line, his heart pounding, as the scabs marched toward the gate. And then he saw him. At the front of the line, his face a mask of shame and fear, was his own cousin, Seamus, who had broken to feed his family. His family was divided. His blood was betraying him. The strike culminated in a final bloody battle, the stand at Harper's Gate. The strikers built a barricade. The Pinkertons attacked. From the wall above, Flannery, with Seamus standing beside him, fired a revolver into the crowd. A Pinkerton on the ground took aim at Joseph. Liam saw it all. He didn't think. He ran. He shoved Joseph out of the way just as the pistol flashed. The bullet tore through Liam's chest. Liam survived. The strike was broken. The men went back to work. He had lost everything. His family in Ireland was gone. His family in America was a traitor. He was blacklisted, a wanted man. But his iron resolve remained. He met the Union man Morgan one last time. "You lost the battle, lad, but the idea is growing." Liam finally understood. He had to stop being the mill's muscle. He had to become the words. He turned his back on the furnaces and walked to a printer's shop. His new mission, to learn to read. The battle was over. The war had just begun.
A fading promise in the old world. The wind that swept down from the Comra Mountains had a bite to it, a hungry cold that no amount of turf on the fire could fully repel. It whistled through the ill-fitting door of the cottage, carrying the damp smell of peat and decay. For Liam O'Connor, it was the sound of an ending. He sat at the rough-hewn table, hands wrapped around a tin mug of weak, bitter tea. His knuckles were raw, the skin split from a day spent digging potatoes that were more blight than bounty. Across from him, his father, Eamon, stared into the low flames of the hearth, his breath catching in a dry, rattling cough that had become the rhythm of their lives. This was not the Ireland Eamon had spoken of from his own youth. The stories of full harvests, of lively ceilidhs where the music didn't stop until dawn, of a land that, while never easy, was at least generous. They all felt like fables now. The promise of this place, the one that had held the O'Connor family to this small patch of rocky soil for 5 generations, was wearing thin. It was a threadbare blanket, offering no warmth against the coming winter. Liam was 21, built with the broad shoulders and strong back of a blacksmith, a trade his grandfather had practiced with pride. But the forge in the village had been cold for 2 years. Its owner had left for Liverpool, defeated. The quarries to the north, which once employed half the men in the county, now only kept a skeleton crew. Lord Ashworth, their landlord, preferred to lease his lands for grazing, a far more profitable venture than dealing with tenants who increasingly couldn't pay. "He'll be by today," Eamon said, his voice a gravelly whisper. He didn't need to say who. Mr. Thornton, the land agent, was as predictable as the tide and twice as cold. "I have something," Liam said, more to convince himself than his father. "The last of the sacks. It's almost enough." Eamon let out a short, harsh laugh that turned into another racking cough. "Almost," Eamon said. "Almost is a word that will put us on the road, boy. Almost is the difference between this roof and a ditch." Liam's gaze drifted to his younger sister, Anya, asleep on a straw pallet near the fire. She was 12, small for her age, her face pale and thin. The fever she had carried for a month had finally broken, but it had left her frail.
The promise of the old world, for him, was no longer about land or pride. It was about the hollow look in her sister's eyes and the guilt that gnawed at his gut. He pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the stone floor. "I'll go to the village, see if Mr. Doyle has any work, hauling, mending, anything." "Doyle has no more work than we have gold," Eamon muttered, but he didn't stop him. There was nothing else to be done. The walk to the village was a study in desolation. Fields lay fallow, their stone walls crumbling. Cottages that had once housed families, the Donnellys, the Keoghs, were now dark, their thatched roofs collapsing inward. They had been assisted to emigrate, a clean-sounding phrase that covered the brutal reality of eviction and forced passage. The village itself was a ghost. The pub, once the heart of our community, held only 3 old men nursing watered ale, their voices low and conspiratorial. Liam saw no sign of Doyle, the grocer. He did, however, see Mr. Thornton. The agent was a tall, lean Englishman in a tweed coat that looked out of place and offensively expensive. He was standing outside the baker's, making notes in a small leather book. As Liam passed, Thornton looked up, his eyes as grey and flat as the sky. He didn't nod in greeting. He simply watched Liam, his expression unreadable, before making another note. The small gesture felt like a judgment, a scratching of a name from a list. Liam felt a familiar, hot surge of anger in his chest. It was an impotent rage, one he had to swallow daily. He was strong, he was smart, and he was willing to work until his hands bled. But in this land, in this time, it meant nothing. He was a prisoner of his birth, chained to a dying patch of earth by a system that didn't care if he lived or starved. He returned to the cottage empty-handed, the cold wind at his back. He found his father just as he had left him, but the air in the small room was thick with a new tension. A piece of paper sat on the table. It wasn't an eviction notice, not yet. It was a final accounting, a list of debts, of rents past due, of fees for grazing their single bony cow. "He came while you were out," Eamon said, his voice flat. "He gives us until the end of the week. Then, the constables." The end of the week. 4 days. Liam picked up the paper. The numbers blurred. It was an impossible sum. He crumpled it in his fist, the stiff paper crackling in the silence. "I will not be put on the road, Da," Liam said, his voice low and shaking with a force that surprised him. "I will not see Anya die in a ditch." "And what will you do?" Éanan shot back, his own fear sharpening his words. "Will you fight him? Fight the constables? Fight all of England with your bare hands? Don't be a fool, boy. Our fight is over." "Your fight, maybe," Liam said, the words tasting like ash. "Not mine." That night, Liam didn't sleep. He sat by the dying embers long after his father and sister were lost in whatever restless peace they could find. The promise was not just fading, it was dead. The land his ancestors had loved and bled for had betrayed them. It offered no future, only a slow, cold surrender. He thought of his grandfather's anvil, sold for scrap. He thought of his mother, buried in the churchyard after a winter of hunger had taken her. He thought of Anya's small, trusting hand in his. The rage from earlier returned, but it was different now. It was no longer hot and directionless. It was cold, heavy, and solid. It settled in his stomach like a block of iron. He rose and walked to the small wooden chest that held their few possessions. From underneath his mother's only good shawl, he pulled a letter. It had arrived 2 months ago, postmarked Pittsburgh, USA. His cousin, Seamus, had sent it. Liam couldn't read well, but he had paid the schoolmaster a penny to read it to him, and he remembered every word. "It is terrible work, Liam. The heat from the furnaces is a living thing. The air is black with smoke, and a man can lose a hand or his life for a moment's carelessness. They call it Bessemer steel, and it is a hungry god. But they pay. In 1 week I make what a man in our village hopes to see in a year. There is work here for a strong back. There is a chance. A chance. It was a word he hadn't dared to think about. He looked at the letter, its creases worn from 100 unfoldings. It was a whisper from another world, a world of fire and smoke and noise, but one that paid in coin, not in almosts. Eamon stirred in his sleep. "Mary," he murmured, his wife's name a prayer on his lips. Liam's decision solidified. It was no longer a question of if, but how. The old world had broken his father, had taken his mother, and was now coming for his sister. He would not let it. He carefully opened the loose floorstone near the hearth. His mother had hidden a small cloth-wrapped bundle there years ago. Inside were 3 silver shillings and her own mother's wedding ring. It was their emergency fund, the sum of their family's worldly wealth. It was not enough for passage, not even for one. Liam stared at the ring, a simple gold band. His father would sooner starve than sell it. A new, colder resolve settled over him. He would not ask. He tucked the ring and the shillings into his pocket. He would walk to Waterford in the morning. He would find the shipping agent. He would sell the ring. He knew a man, a publican, with greedy eyes, who would give him half what it was worth, and he would have to take it. It would be a betrayal, another sin to carry with him. But it was a sin he was willing to bear. He stepped outside into the pre-dawn chill. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, the first hint of light just touching the peaks of the mountains. The land was beautiful, he thought, a cruel, beautiful liar. It promised life and gave only a slow, cold death. He looked back at the cottage, a dark shape huddled against the hillside. Inside were the 2 people he loved most in the world. He was leaving them. He was abandoning his father to face Thornton alone. The guilt of it was a physical weight threatening to crush him. "I am not leaving them to die," he told himself, the words a silent vow. "I am leaving to save them." He would go to this Pittsburgh. He would face the fire and the smoke. He would earn the coin, and he would send for them. He would pull them out of this dying world, even if it meant cutting out a piece of his own soul to do it.
Liam O'Connor turned his back on the rising sun. He faced west, toward the dark, churning expanse of the Atlantic. The promise of the old world was a cold corpse behind him. Ahead, there was only the unknown, a voyage to a new horizon. And in his gut, the unbending, unforgiving weight of iron. The voyage to a new horizon. The walk to Waterford was a pilgrimage of penance. Liam moved in a haze of exhaustion and self-loathing, fueled only by the cold, hard knot of resolve in his gut. He did not sleep. He ate only the heel of bread he'd stuffed in his pocket, the stale crumbs tasting like sawdust. With every step, the 3 silver shillings and his grandmother's ring felt like weights, dragging him down, not just in his pocket, but on his soul. He skirted his own village, cutting across the frosty fields to join the main road, a path already worn by the feet of thousands who had walked it before him. He was just one more shadow in a long, sorrowful procession. He reached Waterford on the 2nd day, his feet blistered and bleeding inside his worn boots. The city was a bedlam of noise and desperate commerce. The sharp scent of coal smoke, brine, and horse manure filled the air. The quays swarmed with people, families huddled on their bundled possessions, sharp-eyed agents promising swift passage on unseaworthy vessels, and gaunt-faced men like himself trying to look strong while their insides hollowed out with fear. His first stop was not the shipping office. It was a dark, narrow pub called the Rusted Anchor.
its windows so grimed with salt and soot that they let in almost no light. The publican matched the establishment. He had a face like a spoiled potato and eyes that missed nothing. Liam approached the bar, his hand trembling as he brought out the small cloth bundle. "I need to sell this," he said, his voice a low croak. The publican unwrapped the ring, his thick fingers surprisingly deft. He held the simple gold band up to the single gas lamp. "My condolences," he said, his voice devoid of any. "Who's she?" "My grandmother's," Liam said, the words catching in his throat. The man grunted. He tossed the ring onto a small brass scale. "Gold is gold, but a wedding band, it's bad luck to melt one." He named a price that was a fraction of the shillings Liam had hoped for, but he added the coins to the 3 shillings already on the bar. "With your shillings, it's enough to buy you a coffin in steerage, not a penny more." He swept the coins into his pocket, the metal biting into his palm. The man had given him half what it was worth, just as he'd known he would. The betrayal was complete. He had sold his family's last sacred memory for a chance to stand in the filth of a ship's hold. "Don't spend it all on whiskey, boy," the publican called after him as he left. "It won't be enough to drown the leaving of it." Liam's passage was booked on a ship called the Ethelred. It was not a passenger vessel. It was a timber ship bound for Philadelphia that packed human cargo into its hold as ballast. His name was scrawled onto a ledger, his coins swept into a box. He was given a tin disc with a number. He was no longer Liam O'Connor. He was steerage passenger 114. They were herded aboard 2 days later at high tide, a miserable, shuffling mass. A doctor, reeking of gin, glanced at their tongues and checked their eyes for fever before waving them on. To be turned back now, with his money spent and the ring gone, would have been a fate worse than death. Liam passed, his heart hammering. Then they descended. If the quay was Bedlam, the steerage hold was a circle of hell. The ladder led down into a cavern of darkness, the air so foul it was a physical blow. It was the stench of unwashed bodies, of stale food, of vomit, of the bilge below, and of pure, concentrated despair. The ceiling was barely 6 feet high, forcing a tall man like Liam to stoop. Crude wooden bunks, nothing more than wide shelves, were stacked 3 high against the hull. There were no lanterns. The only light came from the few slivers of day that pierced the gaps in the hatch cover, which was quickly battened down above them. The darkness was absolute, filled with the sounds of 100 people settling into their misery, the weeping of a young mother, the racking cough of an old man, the whimper of a child, and the low, constant murmur of prayers in Irish. Liam found his assigned bunk, a middle shelf, barely 2 feet wide, which he was to share with another man. His bunkmate was a rail-thin weaver from Galway, who was already shivering with a fever he'd brought from home. The ship lurched, a deep groan of timber announcing their departure from the quay. A collective wail rose from the darkness, the sound of the last tie to home being severed. Liam braced himself against the bulkhead, his eyes shut tight. He did not weep. The iron in his gut had cooled, hardening into something brittle and sharp. He pictured Anya's face, his father's slumped shoulders. For them, for them. The first week was a blur of seasickness. The Atlantic, in its late autumn fury, tossed the Ethelred like a block of wood. The hold became a nightmare. Men and women were too ill to even reach the slop buckets, and the floor was soon awash in filth. The air, already thick, became unbreathable. Twice a day, a crewman would lower buckets of watery, salted gruel and tins of brackish water, barely enough to sustain life. Liam, with his strong constitution, was one of the first to find his sea legs. He forced himself to eat the rock-hard biscuit and drink the foul water, knowing that weakness was a death sentence. His bunkmate, the weaver from Galway, was not so fortunate. He died on the 9th day. his passing so quiet that Liam only realized it when the man's shivering finally stopped. The body was taken without ceremony, wrapped in a scrap of canvas, and slid overboard. Liam now had the bunk to himself, a luxury that filled him with a cold, hollow guilt. He learned to live in the dark. He learned the ship's rhythms, the groaning of the hull, the shouts of the sailors above, the bell that marked the miserable hours. He spent most of his time in his bunk trying to shut out the noise, the smell, and the proximity of so much suffering. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. One night a storm hit, a true North Atlantic gale. The ship climbed mountainous waves only to plunge into the troughs with a force that felt like it would split the hull. The cargo of timber shifted with a sound like giants pounding on the walls. In the hold, it was pure terror. The hatch was sealed. They were trapped. Water began to pour through the seams in the deck above, cold seawater that mixed with the filth on the floor. People were screaming, praying, calling out the names of saints. A stack of luggage broke free and crushed a small boy's leg, his screams cutting through the roar of the wind and sea. Liam didn't pray. He wedged himself into the corner of his bunk, his arms braced against the timbers, and rode it out. He felt the ship's agony as if it were his own. He thought ridiculously of his grandfather's forge. This was what it felt like to be a piece of iron in the fire. Beaten, reshaped, all impurities burned away. If he survived this, he would be something new, something harder. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, the air in the hold was lethal. The sickness which had been lurking now spread with terrifying speed. They called it ship fever, typhus. It started with a rosy rash and a high fever, then delirium. It took the weakest first, the old and the very young. Liam watched, helpless, as a family of 5 from Cork was reduced to 2. I saw a young woman, no older than himself, lose her mind, singing folk songs to her dead infant for a full day before she too fell silent. He shared his meager water ration with a small girl who reminded him of Anya. He would hold the tin cup to her cracked lips, his large, rough hand gentle. She died anyway. He stopped trying to help. He built a wall around himself, focusing only on his own survival. He would not get sick. He would not die here. He would not let this all be for nothing. The voyage stretched into its 5th, then its 6th week. The horizon was a monotonous gray circle, an endless watery prison. The people in the hold were no longer people. They were skeletons draped in rags, moving with the slow, grim motions of the doomed. Then, one morning, a new sound, a change in the sailors' calls. A cry from the man in the crow's nest, a word that ripped through the ship. Land! A weak croaking cheer rose from the hold. Those who could stand staggered toward the hatchway, desperate for a glimpse of their new world. Liam waited, letting the first wave of hopefuls push past. He gathered his one small, near-empty satchel. He was weaker, thinner by 20 pounds, and covered in lice, but he was alive. When he finally climbed the ladder, the light was blinding. He stumbled onto the deck, his eyes watering, and inhaled his first breath of clean, cold air in nearly 2 months. It smelled of pine and damp earth. The new horizon was not a golden sunrise. It was a low, dark smudge of land, a gray coastline under a gray sky. As they sailed up the Delaware River, he saw a city, larger than Dublin and Waterford combined. But it was not a place of beauty. It was a sprawling, frantic mass of brick and wood, chimneys pumping black smoke into the air. It looked hard,
loud, and unforgiving. As the Ethelred slid into its berth in Philadelphia, the steerage passengers were held back, forced to wait as the first-class cabins emptied. When they were finally allowed to disembark, they were not welcomed. They were herded onto the dock, shouted at by men in uniforms, their bundles searched. Liam stood on the solid ground, the quay still seeming to pitch and roll beneath his feet. He had 2 coins left from the publican. He was filthy, exhausted, and friendless in a new continent. In his pocket, his hand closed around the crumpled, sweat-stained letter from his cousin Seamus. It was his only map. Pittsburgh. It was still hundreds of miles away. He looked at the chaos of the American city, at the tall buildings and the Russian, indifferent crowds. The voyage was over, but the journey had just begun. He shouldered his bag, his face grim. The new horizon was not a promise, it was a challenge. And Liam O'Connor, forged in the dark and the cold, was ready to meet it.
First steps on cobblestone. The world, which for 6 weeks had been a rocking, groaning darkness, was now a violent explosion of light and sound. Liam O'Connor staggered onto the dock at Philadelphia, his legs buckling. The cobblestones under his feet felt alien and unstable, as if the earth itself was pitching on a heavy sea. His sea legs were useless on solid ground. He was shoved from behind by another passenger, then jostled by a drayman hauling a cart piled high with barrels. "Move it, Greenhorn! Out of the way!" the man spat, not even looking at him. Liam stumbled to the side, pressing himself against a brick wall, just trying to breathe. The air was not the clean, salt-scoured air of the Atlantic, nor the damp, peaty air of home. It was a thick, acrid soup of coal smoke, stockyard manure, roasting coffee, and the foul mud of the riverbed. The noise was a physical assault. Iron-shod wheels clattering on stone, steam whistles shrieking, merchants shouting in English, German, and languages he couldn't place. It was the sound of 1,000 gears grinding at once. He was a ghost in this machine, filthy from the voyage, his clothes hanging in rags, his hair matted. He was invisible and offensive all at once. People skirted around him, their faces pinched in distaste. He had 2 coins left from the publican in Waterford, 2 small, heavy pieces of betrayal. His stomach, long accustomed to watery gruel, now cramped with a savage hunger. He saw a vendor pushing a cart piled with what looked like meat pies. The smell was overpowering. He pointed, holding out one of his precious coins. The vendor, a fat man with a stained apron, snatched the coin and tossed him a pie. Liam ducked into an alleyway, his hands shaking, and took a ravenous bite. It was rancid. The meat was a gray, gristly paste, the crust doughy and cold. He gagged, spitting it out onto the cobbles. He had just spent half of his entire fortune on garbage. A hot, stinging shame brought tears to his eyes, but he forced them back. It was his first lesson in this new world. Trust nothing that is offered freely. Trust nothing at all. He pushed the anger down, letting it bank the cold iron of his resolve. He needed 2 things, information and the money to act on it. His cousin's letter, a worn talisman in his pocket, said Pittsburgh. It was the only word he held on to. He began to walk, following the flow of the heaviest traffic, deeper into the city. He was looking for someone like himself, but the other Irish from the Aethelred had scattered like leaves, many met by relatives or absorbed into the teeming, wretched alleyways of the waterside slums. He was alone. He tried asking for direction. "Pittsburgh?" he said to a man policing the street. The man tapped his billy club on the pavement. "What about it? Got papers? Got money for the rail? No? Then keep moving. No vagrancy." Liam moved, his frustration mounting. He understood only half the words, but the meaning was clear. He was a problem to be moved along. He kept walking for an hour, his blistered feet screaming, until he found what he was looking for: work. The docks were a frantic, desperate marketplace of muscle. Hundreds of men, black and white, immigrant and native-born, milled around the warehouses, waiting for a foreman to point a finger. "Need 4 men," a voice bellowed from a loading platform. "Haulin' pig iron, a dime for the day!" A surge of bodies pressed forward. Liam, using the height and shoulder width that had been useless in Ireland, pushed his way to the front. The foreman, a burly man with a face like a clenched fist, looked him up and down. He scanned Liam's broad back and thick arms. "You, and you, and you, and you. The rest of ye, get!" Liam felt a jolt of savage relief. He had been chosen. The next 10 hours were a descent into a new kind of hell, one that made the ocean crossing seem like a period of rest. Pig iron was exactly that, rough-cast ingots of raw iron, heavy, awkward, and sharp. His job was to haul them from a towering, precarious stack and load them onto a wagon, which then took them to a canal barge. His hands, softened by weeks of idleness on the ship, were shredded within the first hour. The skin tore, and the raw flesh beneath grated against the abrasive metal. He ignored it. He wrapped strips of cloth torn from his shirt around his palms and kept working. He worked in a silent, brutal rhythm, shoulder to shoulder with the other 3 men. One was a broad-shouldered black man who moved with an economy of motion Liam envied. One was a wiry German who muttered to himself. The last was another Irishman, older, with the haunted, hollow eyes of a man who had seen too much. They did not speak. There was no energy for words. There was only the lifting, the carrying, the dropping, and the return for more. Once the older Irishman stumbled, an ingot slipping from his grasp. It crashed onto his foot, and the sound of bone snapping was sickeningly clear. He screamed and collapsed. The foreman was there in an instant. "Get him out of the way!" he roared. He didn't look at the injured man, but at the gap in the line. He pointed into the crowd of hopefuls still waiting. "You, take his spot!" 2 men dragged the Irishman, who was now weeping and clutching his ruined foot, into an alleyway. A new man, younger and faster, took his place. The work did not pause for a second. Liam's mind went blank. He became a machine. He was no longer Liam O'Connor, a son, a brother. He was a pair of arms, a pair of legs, and a strong back. He lifted, he carried, he dropped. His body screamed. His back felt as if it were being torn from his spine. But with every ingot he moved, he thought of the moldy pie. He thought of his last coin. He thought of Anya. This was the work Seamus had spoken of. This was the cost of a chance. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the smoggy sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, the foreman blew a whistle. "That's the day," he yelled. The men stopped, dropping where they stood, chests heaving. Liam leaned against a wall, his entire body a single throbbing ache. The foreman came by, shoving coins into their raw, bloody hands. Liam stared at the metal. A dime and a few other small coins. It was more money than he had ever earned in a single day in his life. It was the price of his flesh. He didn't know where to go. He couldn't sleep in the street. The watchman would have him in a cell. He found the older docker, the one who had first advised him. "Where to sleep?" Liam asked, his voice rough. The man looked at Liam's hands. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, ye earned your pay, lad." He pointed. "Go to Mother Mulligan, down that alley. Tell her Finn sent ye. She's a thief, but the bedbugs are cleaner than the ones in the jail. Cost you 2 pennies. Liam nodded his thanks. He bought a loaf of dark, heavy bread, this time from a proper baker, sniffing it before he handed over the coin, and a heel of cheese. He paid his 2 pennies at Mother Mulligan's, a windowless, suffocating room crammed with 20 other men in flea-ridden bunks. He didn't care. He crawled onto a straw pallet, not even bothering to take off his boots. He ate half the bread, the rough crust scraping his throat, and was asleep before he finished chewing. He awoke before dawn, his body stiff as a board. Every muscle was afire of pain. He arose. His first steps on the wooden floor were a pure agony. He ate the rest of his bread, the rough crust scraping his throat, and stepped out onto the cobblestones. The city was already stirring. He would not work the docks again, not if it meant being crippled like the man yesterday. He had earned a pittance, but it was his. He would use it to move. He went back to the quay, but this time to the canal basin, a place he'd spotted during his day of labor. Barges were being loaded, bound for the west. He found a map painted on the side of a shipping office. He saw the word Philadelphia, and far to the west, Pittsburgh. Between them was a long, winding line, the main line of public works, a combination of railroad and canal. He approached a man tending a barge mule. "Pittsburgh?" The man laughed. "On this? This is a freight barge, boy. Take you 3 weeks. Cost you $2. Liam's heart sank. He had less than $1. "But," the man said, eyeing Liam's shoulders, "Captain sometimes lets a man work his passage. Swabbing the deck, tending the mule, ask him." Liam found the captain. He held out his coins. "Work," he said, pointing to himself, then to the barge, then west. "Pittsburgh."
The captain was a pragmatic man. He looked at Liam's shredded hands, then at his strong back. A man willing to work himself to the bone for almost nothing was a valuable commodity. "Get on," he said, pocketing Liam's coins. "You'll be tending the relief mule, and you'll sleep with him. Don't expect pay, but you'll get to Harrisburg. From there, you'll have to find your own way." It was not Pittsburgh, but it was west. Liam O'Connor stepped from the cobblestones of the city onto the wooden deck of the barge. He hadn't been in Philadelphia for even 48 hours. He had been cheated, broken, and remade. As the barge was poled away from the dock and into the dark, quiet waters of the canal, he didn't look back. The city, with its noise and its cruelty, disappeared behind him. His first steps on the new continent were over. Now, the real journey could begun. The shadow of the steel mills. The journey west was a slow crawl through a vast, unfolding landscape that dwarfed anything Liam had ever known. The canal barge was his world, a floating prison of labor. By day, he tended the mule, walking the towpath for miles under a relentless sun, his thoughts as monotonous as the plodding hooves of the animal. By night, he slept in the animal's stall, the scent of hay and sweat a strange comfort. He learned to read the landscape, the gentle, rolling hills of Pennsylvania giving way to the formidable forested ridges of the Appalachians. At Harrisburg, the canal ended. The captain gave him a heel of bread and pointed him toward the railroad. "Over the mountains from here, boy. God be with ye." What followed was the most arduous part of his journey. The Allegheny Portage Railroad was not a simple track. It was an engineering marvel and a trial of endurance. He walked the tracks, occasionally catching a ride on a flat car for a few miles in exchange for helping to load timber. He climbed the great inclines, watching with awe as steam engines hauled entire canal boats and rail cars up the steep mountainsides on massive groaning cables. For a boy who had only known stone cottages and dirt tracks, it felt like witnessing the work of giants. He was no longer alone. He fell in with a river of humanity flowing west. German families with their life's possessions piled on handcarts, other gaunt-faced Irishmen, hopeful prospectors, and failed farmers. They were all drawn by the same magnetic pull, the promise of work and land in the Ohio Valley. They shared scraps of food and scraps of stories, their languages different, but their expressions of hope and fear universal.
It was from these fellow travelers that he first heard Pittsburgh described not as a city, but as a condition. "They call it the Smoky City," a German blacksmith told him, his face already grimed with the dust of the road. "My cousin works there. Says you can't see the sun till midday. Says you wash your shirt in the morning and it's black by noon." "Hell with the lid off," is what I heard, an Irishman added, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "But there's coin in that hell, coin for any man willing to burn for it." Liam listened, the iron in his gut growing colder. He had not come this far to be frightened by stories of smoke. After nearly a month of walking, working, and riding, he crested the last ridge of the Allegheny Mountains. Below him, two rivers, the Allegheny and the Monongahela, converged to form a third, the mighty Ohio. And at that confluence, nestled in a valley, lay Pittsburgh. The stories had not been lies. The city was shrouded in a permanent, self-generated twilight. A dense yellow-brown pall of smoke hung over the valley, so thick that it blurred the edges of the buildings and turned the afternoon sun into a hazy copper disk. From this gloom rose hundreds, no, thousands of smokestacks, each belching its own plume of black, gray, or rust-colored smoke into the already choked sky. Even from this distance he could hear it, a low, constant, inhuman roar, punctuated by the shriek of steam whistles and the percussive clang of hammer on steel. This was not a city. It was a furnace. As he descended into the valley, the air grew thick and tasted of sulfur and grit. Soot settled on his skin and clothes, a fine black powder that worked its way into every pore. The grand natural beauty of the mountains he had just crossed was a forgotten memory. Here, nature was not just tamed, it was beaten, burned, and buried under slag and iron. The city itself was a chaotic warren of rail yards, warehouses, and densely packed brick tenements, all stained black by the relentless fallout from the stacks. The streets were a mire of mud, coal dust, and animal waste. Life here was lived under the shadow of the steel mills. They were the landscape, the horizon, and the sky. Their presence was absolute. I felt a tremor of fear, the first he had allowed himself since leaving home. This place did not feel like a new beginning. It felt like an end. He clutched the address from Seamus's litter. Stryker's Row, near the Jones and Laughlin Mill, south side. It was his only map in this inferno. Finding his way was an odyssey. He was a ghost again, a greenhorn, easily identified by his bewildered expression and ragged clothes. He asked for directions, his accent thick, and was met with suspicion or ignored entirely. He eventually found the Monongahela, a river that flowed not with clear water, but with an oily industrial slick. He followed it, heading toward the greatest concentration of noise and fire. He saw the mills up close for the first time, and the sight stopped him in his tracks. They were not buildings. They were sprawling, skeletal behemoths of iron and brick. They stretched for miles along the riverbank, a jagged line of furnaces, sheds, and rail spurs. Flames, brilliant white and searing orange, erupted from the tops of towering Bessemer converters, lighting up the smoky sky with a demonic glare. The ground beneath his feet vibrated with the ceaseless pounding of steam hammers. Through grime-caked windows, he saw silhouettes of men moving in the firelight, dwarfed by the machinery they served. They were stick figures, feeding a monstrous, insatiable beast. The hungry god, Seamus had written. Now Liam understood. He found Stryker's Row. It was not a row of houses, but a grim alley of leaning three-story wooden tenements crammed between a rail siding and a slaughterhouse. The air was a putrid mix of coal smoke and blood. Children with pale, smudged faces played in the dirt street, their laughter sounding thin and brittle against the industrial roar. He found the number Seamus had written. He climbed a set of rickety, groaning stairs to the 3rd floor, the smell of boiled cabbage, stale beer, and unwashed bodies growing stronger with each step. He knocked on a door. It was opened by a woman with tired eyes and flour on her hands. "Aye?" she asked. "I'm looking for Seamus O'Connor," Liam said, his voice hoarse. "You must be the cousin. From home." She opened the door wider. "He's on the night turn. Won't be back till morning. But come in. Come in out of that air. I'm Mary." The room was tiny, holding a stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. 2 small children stared at him from the floor. Mary gave him a stool and a mug of water. "You've had the long road, then," she said, her voice holding the familiar lilt of County Waterford. "I have. Is he well?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. He's working. It's hard. The work takes a toll. It changes a man." She looked back at me, her eyes searching mine. "This place, it's not what they write in the letters, is it?" I said nothing. I just looked at her worn face, at the soot on the windowsill, at the children who were already pale from a life without sunlight. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, waiting. Mary shared their meager meal of potatoes and bread with me. I tried to help her with chores, but I felt clumsy and useless in the small space. The noise from the mill across the river never stopped. It was the heartbeat of this new world. Just after dawn, the door opened. A man entered, stooping to clear the frame. He was covered from head to foot in a thick layer of black grit, his eyebrows and eyelashes stark white against his darkened skin. He moved with a stiff, painful gait of a much older man, and his face was gaunt, with deep lines etched around his mouth. One of his hands was wrapped in a dirty bandage. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. "Seamus?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man looked up, and in his bloodshot, exhausted eyes, I saw my cousin. Seamus stared at me, his expression a mixture of shock, pity, and a profound weariness. "Liam," he rasped, his voice raw. "Saints preserve us! You actually came!" There was no joy in the reunion. There was no embrace. Seamus collapsed into a chair, letting his head fall into his hands. "You fool! You bloody fool! Why'd you come here?" I stood frozen, the hope that had carried me across an ocean and a continent, turning to ash in my mouth. Seamus looked up, and the despair in his eyes was a physical blow.
"Welcome to Pittsburgh, cousin," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Welcome to the furnace." That night, Liam lay on a straw pallet on the floor. He couldn't sleep. Through the single grimy window, the sky pulsed with a hellish red-orange glow from the mill furnaces. The shadow he had seen from the mountain was not something he could walk out of. He was in it. He was breathing it. And tomorrow he would go with Seamus to the mill gate and beg to be allowed into the fire.
A room for rent, a life for hire. There was no sleep that first night, only a shallow, fitful doze. Liam lay on the floor pallet, every sense assaulted. The air in the tiny tenement room was suffocatingly close, thick with the competing smells of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present sulfurous grit that seeped in through the rattling window frame. Outside, the mill was not a distant noise. It was a physical presence, a ceaseless, pounding giant that shook the very foundations of the building. The sky never went dark,
pulsing with the rhythmic, hellish red glare of the Bessemer converters purging themselves. He watched his cousin Seamus sleep. It was the sleep of the dead, a total, desperate collapse. Seamus's breathing was shallow, punctuated by a dry, hacking cough that brought up black phlegm. His bandaged hand lay on the thin blanket, a stark white punctuation mark in the gloom. This was what the chance looked like. This was the man who had left Ireland full of boasts and bravado, now reduced to this husk. Mary, Seamus's wife, was already up, moving in the pre-dawn shadows, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She stoked the small stove, the scrape of the metal poker grating on Liam's nerves. She saw him watching. "There's no point in talking to him till he's had his sleep," she whispered, her voice flat. "The night turn takes the soul out of the man. He won't be right in the head till noon." She motioned to a small basin of water on a stand. "There's bread on the table. Eat. The mill gates open at 6. You'll want to be there." "He's taken thee?" Liam asked. Mary let out a short, bitter laugh. "He'll point the way. From there, you're on your own. You're selling yourself, lad, just like the rest of 'em." When Seamus finally woke, hours later, the transformation was shocking. The exhausted, broken man from the night before was gone, replaced by a grim-faced stranger. He moved with a stiff, pained energy, gulping down a mug of black, bitter tea and pulling on his stiff, filthy work clothes. "Right," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He didn't ask Liam if he was ready. He didn't offer words of encouragement. "Stay close. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. And for God's sake, try to look like you're worth a damn." He led Liam out of the tenement and into the narrow, muddy alley. Stryker's Row was alive, a river of grim-faced men flowing in one direction, toward the mill. The air was cold, but the smoke from the stacks already warmed it, creating a foul, unnatural climate. They joined the crowd at the main gate of the Jones and Laughlin mill. It was a mass of at least 200 men, a churning sea of desperation. They were a mix of all nations, broad-faced Slavs, wiry Italians, grim-looking Germans, blacks, and a large contingent of Irish, both greenhorns like Liam and hollow-eyed veterans. They were all shapes and sizes, but they shared the same look, a terrible, hungry anxiety. They weren't in a line, they were a mob, pressing against the high iron fence, jostling for a position where they could be seen. "This is the shape-up," Seamus muttered, grabbing Liam's arm and pulling him toward the front. "The yard boss, Mr. Flannery, he comes out at 6. He picks who he needs for the day. A man gets sick, a man gets hurt, a man dies. He needs a body. You're just a body." "What do I do?" Liam asked, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs, a cold dread rising in him. "You look strong," Seamus said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Stand up straight. Don't look him in the eye, not direct, but don't look weak. When he passes, you just look ready." At 6 o'clock on the dot, a small door in the gate opened, and a man stepped out. He wore a bowler hat and a waistcoat, and he carried a hickory stick. This was Mr. Flannery. He walked the line, his pale blue eyes as cold and hard as a winter sky, scanning the men like a farmer inspecting livestock. He tapped a few men with a stick. "You, Kelly, yard gang. You, Schmidt, rail pit. You, Joseph, furnace cleanup." He approached Liam and Seamus. He nodded to Seamus. "O'Connor, back for more." He glanced at Liam, his gaze raking him from head to toe. He took in Liam's height, his broad shoulders, the strength in his arms and back that even the ragged clothes couldn't hide. "New meat?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. "My cousin, Liam, just off the boat, a strong back, a hard worker." Flannery stepped closer to Liam, so close Liam could smell the whiskey on his breath. He tapped Liam's chest with the end of his stick. "Another greenhorn potty, just what I need." He sighed, as if burdened by the poor quality of the world's labor. "We're short in the slag pits. Had a spill last night." He pointed the stick at Liam. "You, 10 cents an hour. You'll be with the hunkies. Follow Joseph.
If you're not dead or crippled by sundown, come back tomorrow." He turned and walked away, his selection complete. The men who hadn't been picked let out a collective mournful sigh and began to disperse, another day without pay, without food. A man next to Liam swore, a low, vicious sound, and spat on the ground where Flannery had stood. "You're in," Seamus said, his voice holding no congratulations. "Don't get killed. I'm in the rolling mill. I'll see you back at the room." He gave Liam a hard, assessing look. "And Liam, welcome to America." Seamus disappeared into one part of the mill, and the man named Yosef, a giant of a man with a blank, placid face, grunted and motioned for Liam to follow. Liam stepped through the gates, and the world he had known ceased to exist. The noise was the first blow. It was not a sound, it was a physical force, a solid wall of sound that hit him in the chest and vibrated through the bones of his skull. It was the roar of 100 locomotives, the shriek of steam, the high-pitched scream of metal being cut, and the earth-shaking percussive thud of steam hammers pounding steel. The air was the second. He couldn't breathe. It was a hot, acrid fog of sulfur, iron dust, and coal particles. He coughed, his lungs rejecting it, but the air was all there was. And the heat. Even in the open yard, the air was scorching, radiating from the massive brick buildings and the ground itself. Yosef led him to the slag pits, a series of trenches and gullies at the base of the massive Bessemer converters. These were the giants Liam had seen from the ridge, 30-foot-tall iron pears that spat fire and smoke. Their job was brutally simple. When the converters were blown, when the air was forced through the molten pig iron to burn off impurities, they created tons of waste, or slag. This slag, still glowing hot, was dumped into rail cars, but much of it spilled, hardening into a black glassy rock in the pits below. Liam's job was to break it. He was given a 12-pound sledgehammer and a long iron bar. He and 3 other men, Yosef and 2 others who spoke no English at all, were a team. They waded into the pit, the ground still hot enough to feel through the soles of his boots. A whistle shrieked. Yosef grabbed Liam and threw him against the pit wall, holding up a piece of corrugated iron as a shield. A river of molten orange slag poured from a chute above them, 20 feet away, splashing and hissing. The radiant heat was instantaneous and unbearable. It was like standing in front of an open furnace. It seared his exposed skin, and he could feel his eyebrows and the hair on his arms singe. Then just as quickly, it stopped. The whistle blew again. Yosef grunted, "Go!" They attacked the newly cooled but still dangerously hot slag. It was a race against time. They had to break it up and shovel it into wheelbarrows before the next dump. Liam swung the sledgehammer. The first blow bounced off the glassy surface with a painful shock that ran up his arms.
The weight of the bidding war. Liam's world shrank to the dimensions of the slag pit. It was a 10 by 20-foot trough of black, glassy rock, searing heat and choking dust. His life was measured in 8-minute cycles. The shriek of the warning whistle, the blinding hot cascade of molten waste, the agonizing, skin-blistering wave of radiant heat, and then the mad scramble. He, Joseph, and the 2 other Slavs, whom he learned were called Pavel and Stork, would attack the cooling, steaming mass with sledgehammers and pry bars. It was a race. They had to break the slag into manageable chunks and shovel it into the waiting wheelbarrows before the next whistle, before the next fiery dump. Liam learned the rhythm through pain. He learned not to wipe the sweat from his face, as his hands were covered in sharp, glassy grit that would tear his skin. He learned to breathe through a damp cloth tied around his mouth, a futile attempt to filter the sulphurous air. He learned to swing the sledge not with the frantic energy of his first day, but with a low, steady, back-breaking pace that he could maintain for 12 hours. His body was a map of new agonies. His hands, which had been shredded on the docks, were now calloused, but those calluses cracked open and bled.
the wounds instantly cauterized by the heat and filled with black grit. His back was a solid knot of fire. His eyes burned constantly from the fumes. But he was strong. His physical power, so useless in Ireland, was his only currency here. Joseph, the giant wordless crew leader, seemed to respect it. He would grunt and nod at Liam, pointing to the largest, most stubborn chunks of slag, and Liam would break them. They were a machine, a four-man engine of destruction, fueled by bread and water and fear. On the third day, the nature of the race changed. The bidding war, which Liam had only understood as the scramble for a job at the gate, took on a new, more sinister meaning. Mr. Flannery appeared on the catwalk above the pits, his bowler hat a clean, dark circle in the hazy air. He wasn't looking at them. He was walking with a man in a clean suit, pointing and talking. The man was checking a ledger. A few minutes later, Flannery came down to the pit floor, something he rarely did. The air of indifference was gone, replaced by a nervous, predatory energy. "Not fast enough," he snapped, striking the side of a rail car with his hickory stick. The crack of it was sharp, even above the din. "The Duquesne Works just won the Pennsylvania rail contract. They're bidding steel at a price that's cutting our throat." He pointed his stick at Joseph's crew, then at a rival crew of Irishmen in the next pit. "Scanlon, your crew is slow. Last in the pit, last in the pay line. Pick it up." Then he looked at Joseph and Liam. "This ain't a damn tea party. I want this slag cleared. I want it cleared before the next dump. We're running the converters on a 10-minute cycle, not 12. First crew to fill their quota gets a 5-cent bonus. Last crew might not be here tomorrow." He walked away, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. The bidding war wasn't just in some far-off boardroom. It was here, in this filthy pit, and the bids were measured in pounds of slag and broken bodies. Joseph's blank face hardened. He looked at his men, then at Scanlon's crew. He roared something in his own language, a single, explosive word. The race was on. What had been brutal was now inhuman. The whistle shrieked. The slag poured. Before the orange glow had even faded to red, Joseph was in the pit, his pry bar sinking into the semi-molten mass. The steam and heat were so intense that Liam felt the soles of his boots begin to melt. He followed. They all did. They were no longer a team. They were 4 desperate individuals fighting for the same small prize, their sledgehammers rising and falling in a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm. Scanlon's crew, goaded by Flannery's threat, did the same. The two crews worked in a frenzied pantomime of labor, separated by a low wall of cooling iron. Liam could see the faces of the other Irishmen. They were pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and rage. One of them, a young man named Finn, barely older than Liam, was working recklessly, his hammer swinging high and wild. "Too fast, boy! Watch the heat!" Scanlon yelled, his crew boss. But Flannery was watching, and the weight of his gaze, the weight of the bidding war, was heavier than any sledgehammer. The whistle for the next dump shrieked. Joseph's crew scrambled back, pulling their barrows. Scanlon's crew did the same. But Finn, in his desperate haste, tried to free one last chunk. His pry bar was stuck. "Finn, leave it!" Scanlon roared. The river of fire poured from the chute. Finn tried to jump back. He slipped on a loose piece of slag. He didn't fall in, but the molten river splashed. A wave of liquid, white-hot slag struck his leg from the knee down. His scream was not a human sound. It was a raw, primal shriek of agony that cut through the mill's roar like a razor. He collapsed, clutching a leg that was no longer a leg, but a smoking, blackened ruin, his boot and trousers instantly cauterized by the heat. Everything stopped. For one horrifying second, the entire yard paused. Then Flannery was there, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get him out," he yelled, Not at the medical orderly, but at Scanlon. "Get him clear." Scanlon and another man, their faces white, grabbed Finn under the arms and dragged him, screaming and writhing, out of the pit. He left a trail of blackened fluid and the sickening smell of burned meat. Liam stood frozen, his hand dangling from his numb hand. His stomach heaved, and he choked back bile. Flannery didn't spare the injured man another glance. He turned to the crowd at the gate, which was already being moved back by a yard ball. He pointed. "Hugh, get a barrow. Take his place. The rest of you, what are you gaping at? That converter doesn't stop. Get back to work." The whistle shrieked. The work continued. Joseph shoved Liam hard. "Robota," he yelled. "Work." Liam turned, his movements stiff and mechanical. He lifted the sledgehammer. He saw the dark, wet patch where Finn had been. He swung the hammer. He brought it down. The weight of it felt immense, as if it were pulling him down into the earth. The weight of the bidding war. It was the weight of Finn's leg. It was the weight of the 5-cent bonus. It was the weight of the new man, already shoveling, his face a mask of terror, desperately trying to keep up. Liam worked until the evening whistle blew. He was in a daze. He did not feel his burns. He did not feel his back. He just moved, swung, lifted, and dumped. Joseph's crew had won the bonus. He collected his pay, $1.25, his base pay for 12 hours, plus the 5 cents. He held the coins in his hand. They were warm and heavy. He walked back to Stryker's Row, the mill's glow at his back. He climbed the stairs, the screams of Finn echoing in his head, blending with the rhythm of the steam hammers. He entered the small room. Seamus was there, just waking for the night shift. Mary was at the stove. Liam walked to the table and put down $1. He kept the 25 cents. Mary looked at the coin, then at Liam's face, streaked with black grit, his eyes wide and hollow. That's too much, Liam, for the rent." "It's for the rent," he said, his voice a dead rasp. "And for food. It's my share." Seamus looked at the dollar, then at Liam. He saw the new burns on Liam's arms, the haunted look in his eyes. "So, you saw it today, did you?" Seamus said, his voice quiet. "The bid," Seamus said, standing up. He picked up the dollar and pressed it into Mary's hand. "This is the weight of it, Liam. They bid for steel, so they put a price on our sweat. Then they bid us against each other, the Irish against the hunkies, the day turn against the night, till we're bidding our own blood and bone just to see the next sunrise." Seamus grabbed his own lunch pail. "A man got burned today, I heard. Finn, from Scanlon's crew. His leg." "He's out," Seamus said, his face grim. "He'll be a beggar on Grant Street by Christmas if he lives. And his spot was filled before they even got him to the infirmary. That's the war." Liam sat down on his floor pallet, the exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. He held his remaining quarter in his fist. He had won the bonus. He had beaten Finn. He had paid his rent. He was surviving. And the weight of that victory, the cost of that bid, felt like it was going to crush him.
An unlikely alliance in the smog. The day Finn's leg was incinerated in the pit marked a profound change in Liam. The mill had ceased to be a mere place of hardship. It had become an adversary, a living entity that fed on the desperation of men like him. The weight of the bidding war, he realized, was designed to make them tear each other apart before the furnace had the chance. He was no longer just a greenhorn trying to survive. He was a man watching a battle, forced to choose a side. His work in the slog pit, which had been a frantic scramble for survival, became a study. He no longer swung his sledge with blind, desperate force. He began to watch Joseph. Joseph was a master of his grim craft, the giant, quiet Slav whom the other Irishmen dismissed as a dumb hunky, moved with a brutal, minimalist grace.
He wasted no motion. He seemed to feel the slog cooling, knowing the precise moment to strike, the exact angle to set his pry bar. He conserved his energy, breathing in a steady rhythm, unlike the other men who panted and heaved. He was an animal, as Flannery had called him, but only in the way a wolf is an animal, perfectly adapted to his lethal environment. Liam, with his own raw strength, began to mimic him. He copied Joseph's stance, the way he used the weight of the hammer rather than his arm muscles, the way he stepped back from the heat wave a half second before it washed over the pit. Joseph noticed. During a 10-minute break, a pause for water and bread in the relative cool of the converter's massive shadow, Joseph sat on an overturned bucket. Liam sat near him. The other men, Pavel and Stock, sat apart, muttering in their own tongue. Joseph wordlessly broke his large dark sausage in half and held a piece out to Liam. Liam stared at it. It was a simple gesture, but in the fiercely segregated world of the mill, it was a political act. The Irish kept to the Irish, the Germans to the Germans, and everyone kept their distance from the hunkies. To share food was to declare an association. He thought of the taunts he already endured at the boarding house for working on a foreign crew. He looked at Joseph's impassive face, then at the sausage.
An unlikely alliance in the smog. The day Finn's leg was incinerated in the pit marked a profound change in Liam. The mill had ceased to be a mere place of hardship. It had become an adversary, a living entity that fed on the desperation of men like him. The weight of the bidding war, he realized, was designed to make them tear each other apart before the furnace had the chance. He was no longer just a greenhorn trying to survive. He was a man watching a battle, forced to choose a side. His work in the slag pit, which had been a frantic scramble for survival, became a study. He no longer swung his sledge with blind, desperate force. He began to watch Yosef. Yosef was a master of his grim craft. The giant, quiet Slav whom the other Irishmen dismissed as a dumb hunky moved with a brutal, minimalist grace. He wasted no motion. He seemed to feel the slag cooling, knowing the precise moment to strike, the exact angle to set his pry bar. He conserved his energy, breathing in a steady rhythm, unlike the other men who panted and heaved. He was an animal, as Flannery had called him, but only in the way a wolf is an animal, perfectly adapted to his lethal environment. Liam, with his own raw strength, began to mimic him. He copied Yosef's stance, the way he used the weight of the hammer rather than his arm muscles, the way he stepped back from the heat wave a half second before it washed over the pit. Yosef noticed. During a 10-minute break, a pause for water and bread in the relative cool of the converter's shadow, Yosef sat on an overturned bucket. Liam sat near him. The other men, Pavel and Stek, sat apart, muttering in their own tongue. Yosef wordlessly broke his large, dark sausage in half and held a piece out to Liam. He stared at it. It was a simple gesture, but in the fiercely segregated world of the mill, it was a political act. The Irish kept to the Irish, the Germans to the Germans, and everyone kept their distance from the hunkies. To share food was to declare an association. He thought of the taunts he already endured at the boarding house for working on a foreign crew. He looked at Yosef's impassive face, then at the sausage. He was starving. He took it. Jikuya, Liam tried, mangling a word of thanks he heard Pavel use. Yosef grunted, almost a laugh, and took a bite of his own piece. Liam in turn pulled a small wedge of hard cheese from his own pail and offered it. Yosef took it with a solemn nod. The transaction was complete. Their work became a silent partnership. Yosef would tap a cooling slag heap with his hammer, indicating the fault line, and Liam would follow with a full, powerful swing, splitting it clean. They established a rhythm, a two-man engine of destruction that was faster and more efficient than any four men working against each other. Pavel and Stek, seeing the new dynamic, fell in line,
following their lead. Their crew, once a collection of desperate individuals, became a team, and they began to win the 5-cent bonus every single shift. This did not go unnoticed. Flannery had wanted a war. He had gotten a machine. He watched them from the catwalk, his hickory stick tapping, his eyes narrowed. He saw an Irishman and 3 Slavs working in perfect, unspoken harmony, and he saw a threat to his power. The resentment from the other crews grew palpable. Scanlon's crew in particular was bitter. They were now consistently the last to meet their quota, and Flannery's verbal abuse was merciless. They saw Liam not as a man succeeding, but as a traitor who had chosen the hunkies over his own people, making them all look bad. The tension came to a head one Saturday night. The shifts were over, and the men, paid for the week, sought the brief, cloudy oblivion of the saloon. Liam walked into the Shamrock, the smoky, crowded tavern in Stryker's Row that served as the unofficial headquarters for the Irish mill workers. He was just there for a single beer to cut the coal dust from his throat before returning to his rented room. He'd just gotten his drink when a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. It was Scanlon, his face flushed with whiskey and rage. With him were 2 other men from his crew, including Doolan, a belligerent man who had lost his bonus all week. "Well, look who it is," Scanlon sneered, his voice loud enough to quiet the room. "If it ain't the hunky lover himself, O'Connor." Liam stood still. "I don't want trouble, Scanlon." "Don't ye?" Doolan shoved him. "Too good for your own kind now, are ye? Too good to work with white men? You like the smell of garlic and cabbage that much?" A circle formed around them. This was more than a drunken brawl. It was a trial. "I work where the foreman puts me," Liam said, his voice low and cold. "And I work to stay alive, same as you." "Liar," Doolan shouted, jabbing a finger into Liam's chest. "You're making us look bad. You and your animal friends are working for pennies, and Flannery's using it to break us. You're a scab, O'Connor, a traitor to your own." "He's not a traitor," New Voice said. The voice was deep, guttural, and absolutely out of place. The crowd parted. Yosef was standing in the doorway of the Irish saloon. Behind him, silhouetted in the smoggy night, were Pavel and Stack. The entire tavern went dead silent. The fiddler's arm froze mid-bow. A hunky had never set foot in the Shamrock. To do so was an open, suicidal challenge. Scanlon and Doolan turned, their mouths open. They saw Yosef, a man who dwarfed them both, his massive arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. He hadn't come to fight. He had come to stand. "This is our place," Scanlon stammered, trying to regain his authority. "We don't want your kind here." Yosef ignored him. His eyes were fixed on Liam. He simply looked at him, then nodded once toward the door. It wasn't a command. It was an offer of escort. Doolan, emboldened by whiskey, took a step toward Yosef. "Get out of here, you dumb ox, before—" Yosef didn't move. He didn't tense. He just watched Doolan. He absorbed the threat with a vast, stony indifference that was more terrifying than any counter-threat could have been. Doolan faltered. His bravado evaporated under that immense, silent presence. He looked at Pavel and Stack, who were holding pry bars they'd brought from home, not as weapons, but as a clear statement. Scanlon, a smarter man than Doolan, saw the reality of the situation. A bloody fight here would bring the yard bulls and the police. Everyone would lose their job. "Let him go," Scanlon muttered, pulling Doolan back. "He ain't worth it. He's made his choice." Liam looked at Scanlon, then at Doolan's hateful, frustrated face. He looked at the other Irishmen in the room, men from his own county, who were now staring at him as if he were a stranger. He put his unfinished beer on the bar. He walked past Scanlon, who refused to meet his eye. He walked to the door and stood beside Yosef. Together, the 4 of them, 1 Irishman, 3 Slavs, turned and walked out of the saloon. They stepped back into the familiar, choking smog of the street. They walked in silence, a tight, defensive knot, their boots crunching on the cinder-covered path. They didn't speak.
There were no words of thanks, no oaths of loyalty. None were needed. The unspoken lines of tribe and nation had been crossed. In the suffocating shadow of the mills, where the owners and foremen pitted every man against his brother, they had forged something new. It wasn't friendship. It was an alliance, born of shared risk and mutual respect, a small, hard point of unity in a world built to tear them apart.
The foreman's watchful eye. The alliance with Yosef had saved Liam's skin, but it had also painted a target on his back. In the hierarchy of the mill, there was no greater sin than unity. A foreman like Flannery didn't rule through strength, he ruled through fear. And the primary tool of that fear was division. A crew of men who trusted each other was a crew that couldn't be easily broken, cheated, or replaced. Flannery's watchful eye was now a permanent fixture in Liam's life. The foreman no longer shouted at their crew. Instead, he watched. He would stand on the catwalk above the slag pits, his arms crossed, his hickory stick tapping rhythmically against his thigh, his gaze fixed on Liam. He watched for a slip, a moment of weakness, a single mistake that would give him the excuse he needed. When their efficiency didn't drop, Flannery changed tactics. He couldn't fire them for being the best crew in the pit, but he could make their lives hell. "O'Connor! Yosef!" he barked one morning, his voice sharp in the pre-dawn chill. "You're done with slag. We've got a furnace reline on number 4. You're on cleanup." A cold silence fell over the other men at the shape-up. Furnace cleanup was a death sentence. A Bessemer converter was lined with special bricks to withstand the 3,000-degree temperatures. But even those bricks melted, cracked, and failed. A reline meant shutting the furnace down for a brief maintenance window, often no more than 12 hours, and sending men inside to clear the rubble and slag before the new bricks could be laid. The problem was that shut down was a relative term. Yosef led Liam, Pavel, and Stock to the base of the towering number 4 converter. It was silent, its great mouth dark, but the air around it vibrated, and the heat radiating from the iron shell was still intense enough to warp the vision. "Wait," Yosef grunted, holding up a hand. He placed his bare palm against the steel. Liam could see the skin of his hand turn white, but Yosef didn't flinch. He held it there for a full 10 seconds, his eyes closed, as if listening. "Now," he said. He pulled open the heavy maintenance hatch. The heat that rolled out was a physical blow. It was not the searing flash of the slag pit. It was the deep, suffocating, breathless heat of an oven. The air inside was a shimmering, toxic soup of brick dust and sulfur. "Cover mouth," Yosef ordered, tying his own rag. "We go. 15 minutes, then out. No more." They crawled inside. The space was a cramped, glowing cavern of red-hot, crumbling brick. The floor was a treacherous landscape of rubble and hardened pools of iron. Their job was to break this rubble and haul it out in buckets. It was the work of demons. The heat was so intense that Liam's clothes began to smoke. The air was so thin of oxygen that his lungs burned and his heart hammered in his chest. After only 2 minutes, he was dizzy, his vision tunneling. He swung his sledge, and the impact sent a shower of hot sparks and razor-sharp brick fragments flying. Beside him, Pavel coughed, a dry, racking sound, and stumbled. Yosef grabbed him before he fell, shoving him toward the hatch. "Von!" he roared. "Out!" He turned to Liam. 5 minutes. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy. Liam felt a large section of the brick wall shift above him. Before he could react, Yosef's massive arm hooked him around the waist and yanked him backward, just as a ton of glowing bricks crashed down exactly where he had been standing. Liam stared, his breath gone. He would have been crushed and cooked. Yosef just pointed at the rubble. "Robota, work." They cleared the pile and scrambled out, collapsing onto the yard floor.
their lungs heaving, their skin boiled red. Flannery was standing there, watching them. There was no concern on his face, only a flat, cold disappointment. Liam had survived. "Get some water," the foreman said, his voice bored. "You've got 10 minutes till you go back in." This was Flannery's game. He couldn't make Liam fail, so he was trying to kill him. The watchful eye wasn't just observing, it was waiting for a death. But the furnace job only seemed to weld the crew tighter. They developed a silent language of nods and grunts, a system of teamwork that got the impossible, deadly job done without a casualty. Liam's strength, guided by Yosef's experience, became a formidable tool. Flannery, watching from a safe distance, grew visibly more frustrated. He tried a new approach. He found Liam one day as he was leaving the mill, alone. Yosef and the others had already gone ahead. "O'Connor," he said, stepping out from the shadow of the gate. His voice was different. It was soft, almost friendly. Liam tensed. "Sir?" "You're a hell of a worker, son," he said, falling into step beside him. He offered Liam a cigarillo, which Liam refused with a shake of his head. "Strong back, good head on your shoulders. You're wasting your time with that crew." Liam said nothing, just kept walking, his eyes straight ahead. "Those hunkies, they're animals. They live in filth. They don't speak the language. They're stuck. They're mules. That's all they'll ever be. But you're different. You're Irish. You speak English. You're white." He put a hand on Liam's shoulder, a gesture of conspiratorial friendship that made Liam's skin crawl. "I've been watching you," he said, "and I think you're better than the slag pits. I'm in need of an assistant wakemaster. It's indoor work. You sit in a booth, you tally the loads. Clean hands. $1.50 a day." Liam stopped walking. $1.50. It was nearly double what he was making now. It was enough to send real money home, enough to get Anya out of Ireland. He pictured a clean room, a life where he wasn't covered in soot, where his lungs didn't burn. What I have to do?" Liam asked, his voice wary. "Just what I said. Tally the loads. Of course, you'd have to be my man. I need eyes and ears on the floor. I need to know who's slacking, who's talking union, who's not pulling their weight." The trap was laid. The weightmaster's booth wasn't just for counting. It was for spying. It was for docking the pay of crews who were supposedly slow, for shaving pounds off their quotas to save the company money. He would be betraying every man in the yard. He would be betraying Yosef. "And," Flannery added, "you can't be seen with that hunky crew anymore. It wouldn't look right. You'd be management." Liam looked at Flannery's pale, clean face. He saw the cold, watchful eyes, now filled with a greedy, persuasive light. He thought of Finn's scream. He thought of Yosef's arm pulling him from underneath the collapsing wall. He thought of the piece of sausage, the first kindness he'd been shown. He knew what this was. It was the same as the publican in Waterford buying his grandmother's ring. It was a bid for his soul. "No," Liam said. Flannery's smile twitched. "What did you say?" "I said no, sir. Thank you for the offer. But I'm with Yosef's crew." Liam turned and started to walk away. "You damned fool!" Flannery's voice was no longer friendly. It was a low, vicious snarl. "You'd rather stay in the dirt with those animals than be a man? You've picked your side, Paddy. Don't you ever forget it." Liam didn't look back. "I won't," he said. The reprisal was immediate. The very next day, the shape-up was a formality. "Yosef, O'Connor, Pavel, Stock, you're off the furnaces. You're on the night turn, rail yard." A groan went up from the men. The night turn in the rail yard was the worst job in the mill. It was heavy, cold, and lethally dangerous. It meant hauling and stacking 90-pound steel rails in near-total darkness, with only the distant flickering light of the converters. The ground was a maze of switching tracks and open pits. A single misstep meant a broken ankle or a crushed limb. And the pay was 10 cents an hour. the same as his first day. It was a public, humiliating demotion. Flannery stared directly at Liam, a smirk playing on his lips. "I told you," his eyes said. "I've been watching." Liam met his gaze, his own face as hard as the steel he worked. He felt no fear. He felt no regret. He just felt the familiar, cold iron of his resolve. He turned and walked toward the rail yard, taking his place beside Yosef. The foreman's watchful eye had seen him, tested him, and judged him, and Liam had given his answer. The war was just beginning.
Whispers of union. The night turn in the rail yard was a different kind of purgatory. The slag pits had been a trial by fire, a blast furnace of immediate, searing danger. The rail yard was a trial by ice, darkness, and crushing weight. Flannery's demotion was a calculated act of cruelty. He had exiled them from the mill's fiery heart to its cold, dark periphery. Here there was no bonus, no shared warmth from the furnaces, no daylight. There was only the vast, skeletal maze of tracks, the endless stacks of 90-pound steel rails, and the biting winter wind that whipped in from the Monongahela River. Their job was to unload the newly milled rails from the flat cars. In the flickering, unreliable gaslight, they would slide the heavy, awkward lengths of steel, each one slick with frost or grease, onto their shoulders and carry them to the stacking grounds. It was brutal, repetitive work that shattered the nerves and numbed the body. The danger was constant, but it was a stealthy danger. A missed step in the dark could mean a broken foot in a railroad switch. A patch of ice could send a man sprawling, the 90-pound rail crashing down on his chest or head. And worst of all, there was the silence, broken only by the clang of steel on steel and the distant, mournful shriek of the yard engines, which would appear from the shadows with little warning, their single lanterns cutting a weak yellow cone in the smog. Flannery had intended this job to break their alliance. He believed that in the cold and in the dark, mutual misery would curdle into resentment. He was wrong. The isolation forged them into something stronger. Out here, there was no one to compete against. There was no Scanlan's crew, no bidding war. There was only the steel, the cold, and the four of them. They were a self-contained unit, an island of 4 men in a black iron sea. Their teamwork, honed in the slag pits, became their only means of survival. They developed a system. Joseph, with his immense strength, would stand on the flat car, sliding the rails down. Liam, with his own power and agility, would catch the end, guiding its fall. Pavel and Stock would work as a pair, hauling it to the stack. They spoke little, communicating in the grunts and nods of men who have absolute trust in one another's movements. They were watched, but not by Flannery. The foreman was a day-turn boss. He was at home in his bed. Their overseer was a yard bull, a company man who mostly stayed warm in his shack, trusting the cold to do his work for him. This relative freedom, this isolation, created a space for something new. It created a space for whispers. The man appeared on a Tuesday night during a lull when the flat cars were empty. He emerged not from the mill, but from the shadows of the tenement alleys that bordered the yard. He was a small, wiry man, his face gaunt, but his eyes burning with a sharp, intelligent light. He wore the clothes of a puddler, but he carried himself differently. He stopped a few yards from them, not approaching too quickly. Pavel and Stock tensed, grabbing their pry bars. "Easy, lads," the man said. His voice was not American. It was a lilting, musical Welsh. "Just came to see the crew Flannery couldn't break." "Who are you?" Liam asked, stepping in front of Joseph. "This is company property." "It's the company's yard, aye, but it's your labor they're using, and they're using it poorly, I'd say." He nodded at Liam. "You're O'Connor?" The Irishman who said no to Flannery's bribe. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? The Welshman smiled, a thin, humorless expression. A clean hand's job as a waymaster. A spot as Flannery's pet, just for telling him which of your brothers is talking too loud or walking too slow. Word gets around, son. You said no. That makes you an interesting man. Is trap, Stock muttered, his eyes darting toward the yard bull's shack. Flannery send him. Flannery would see me hang, the Welshman said dismissively. My name's Morgan, and I'm not here to spy. I'm here to talk. Talk what? Joseph rumbled, his voice a low threat. Morgan looked at the four of them, his gaze assessing. I'm here to talk about why you're here, in the cold, in the dark, working for a dime an hour while Mr. Carnegie builds another library in Scotland. I'm here to talk about Finn Scanlon's leg. I'm here to talk about the bidding war that ain't a war at all, but a slaughter. They got you fighting each other for the scraps while they pile the main feast on their own plates. Liam had never heard anyone speak like this, as if the man had reached into his own chest and pulled out the cold, hard knot of rage he'd been nursing since he'd arrived. What's to talk about? Liam said. It's the work. You take it or you starve. Aye, you take it alone, you starve. One man says, they sayin' safe, they sayin' fair, and he's fired. A new greenhorn takes his place before his boots are cold. That's what Flannery banks on. But what if all the men say it? Pavel, who spoke more English than Stock, shook his head violently. No, it's trouble, big trouble. Trouble is a child dying of fever 'cause you can't afford a doctor, Morgan snapped, his fire returning. Trouble is watching a man get carried out, leaving a leg behind, and the converter don't even stop. That's the trouble we're already in. I'm talking about a new way. He leaned in, the shadows half hiding his face. I'm talking about the amalgamated association. I'm talking about a union. The word hung in the frozen air, as sharp and dangerous as a shard of steel. Union. I'd heard the word spat as a curse by foremen and whispered with a mix of terror and hope by other workers. It was the great unspoken fear of the company. They'll crush us, Liam said, the words tasting like hash. They'll send in the Pinkertons. They'll blacklist us. We'll never work in this valley again. They'll try, Morgan countered. They'll crush one man. They'll crush your crew of 4. But what if it's the entire yard? What if it's the slag pits? What if the puddlers and the rollers and the Bessemer crews all at once? What if 4,000 men stand as one and say, we will not work until we are paid as men, not as mules? Can they fire us all? Can they replace us all at once? Without us, this mill is just a pile of cold iron. That's our power, lad. He looked from man to man. Flannery put you 4 out here to be forgotten. He made you an island, but he made a mistake. He made you a place where men can talk, away from his watchful eye, a place where a seed can be planted. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small crumpled pamphlet. He pressed it into Liam's hand. Read it, he whispered. Talk about it. You're strong men. Joseph, they call you an ox. O'Connor, they see you as a mule. Isn't it time you told him you're a man? Morgan backed away, melting into the shadows as silently as he had come. I'll be back. Think on it. Think on what your life is worth. The 4 of them were left in the cold, the silence of the yard suddenly heavy. Liam's hand was numb, but he could feel the crisp edges of the pamphlet. Pavel and Stock were visibly terrified, both making signs of the cross. We see nothing, we hear nothing, is bad, bad. Liam looked at Joseph. The big man was staring into the darkness where Morgan had disappeared. His face, as always, was a mask. Joseph, Liam asked. Joseph was quiet for a long time, the only sound the clang of a distant coupling. He looked at Pavel and Stock, then at Liam.
He didn't speak. He simply pointed at the next flat car of rails which was being shunted onto their siding. Robota. Work. But as they turned back to the job, Liam saw Joseph look over his shoulder one last time into the shadows. Later that night, huddled behind a stack of rails, Liam unfolded the pamphlet. He couldn't read most of the words, but he understood the ones at the top, printed in bold black letters. Solidarity. An injury to one is the concern of all. The whispers had found them in the dark, and though they were just whispers, they had the weight and power of an avalanche.
A letter stained with tears. The rail yard became their cold, dark purgatory. Weeks bled into one another, each shift a 12-hour battle against crushing weight, numbing cold, and a bone-deep exhaustion that seeped into their marrow. Liam, Joseph, Pavel, and Stak existed as a four-man phantom crew, haunting the periphery of the mill, their work unseen, their struggles unwitnessed. Flannery's demotion, intended to break them, had instead sealed them in a vacuum. In this vacuum, the whispers of the Union man, Morgan, festered. Liam kept the crumpled pamphlet hidden in his boot, a talisman of fire and hope. In the brief, freezing lulls between flat cars, he would pull it out. His literacy was poor, a patchwork of hedge school lessons, but he could piece together the essential words: wage, rights, safety, solidarity. He tried to explain it to Joseph, using a combination of the few English words they shared and a crude sign language. He pointed to his own back, bent with labor. Hurt. He pointed to the icy ground. Bad. He held up the pamphlet. Together. Strong. Joseph understood more than he let on. He would listen, his face a blank mask in the gaslight, and then just nod, his expression unreadable. Robota, he would grunt, turning back to the rails. But he didn't tell Liam to stop. He was listening. Liam's life was reduced to a brutal algorithm: work, eat, sleep. He had moved out of Seamus and Mary's tenement. The tension was too thick. Seamus saw Liam's alliance with the Hunkies as a betrayal, and Liam saw Seamus's resigned bitterness as a surrender. Liam now rented a hot bed, a mattress in a freezing garret shared with two other men who worked opposite shifts. He never slept in a bed that was cold. He saved every cent. He ate stale bread and thin gruel. He patched his own clothes until they were more thread than fabric. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of the city, his entire existence focused on a single, burning goal: scraping together the passage money for Anya. Every rail he lifted was a step closer. Every coin he saved was a piece of her freedom. He was sending small amounts back to the parish priest. With letters he paid a scribe a penny to write, begging him to watch over his sister. Then the letter came. It wasn't a reply from the priest. It had been forwarded from the Waterford post office, following him like a patient bloodhound across the ocean. It was a thin, cheap envelope bearing the postmark of his own village. His name was written on the front in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. He found it waiting for him when he returned from the night shift, the landlady having left it on the grime-caked stairwell. His heart seized. It wasn't from his father. Eamon couldn't write. His hands, thick with calluses and permanently blackened with grease and steel grit, fumbled with the seal. He was shaking, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. He pulled out the single sheet of paper and unfolded it. He couldn't read it. The script was cramped, the words long. He could make out his own name, Liam O'Connor, and the name of his sister, Anya. He saw the name of the landlord,
Ashworth, and the agent, Thornton. A cold dread, sharper than the winter wind in the rail yard, washed over him. He stumbled up to his garret. The day shift worker was already asleep, his snores a rattling wheeze in the small room. Liam sat on the floor, his back against the damp wall, and stared at the letter, his mind racing. He couldn't ask Seamus. He couldn't go to the public scribe, not with this. This was private. This was family. He felt his illiteracy as a physical handicap, a wall between him and the truth. He clutched the letter in his fist for his entire day of sleep, the paper crinkling against his palm. When the time came, he went to the mill, the letter a cold weight in his pocket, heavier than any rail. The night was bitter, a wet snow beginning to fall, hissing as it hit the warmer steel. He, Joseph, Pavel, and Stock worked in their usual grim rhythm. But Liam was clumsy. He fumbled a rail, nearly dropping it on his foot. "Tui?" Joseph grunted, grabbing the rail and steadying it. "You?" He pointed at Liam's head. "Problem?" He just shook his head, unable to speak. He waited until the yard bull had retreated to his shack, a small plume of smoke rising from its chimney. He pulled Joseph behind a towering stack of rails into the deepest shadow. The others followed. "I need," Liam began, his voice cracking. He pulled out the letter. "Please." The three Slavs looked at the paper, then at each other. Joseph took it, holding it upside down. He turned it over, his brow furrowed. He shook his head, a look of genuine regret on his face. "Niet, English, no." Pavel and Stock also shook their heads. They couldn't help him. Liam's shoulders slumped. He felt utterly, terribly alone. He was surrounded by the only men he trusted, and they were as helpless as he was. "A problem with the mail, Mr. O'Connor?" The voice was Welsh, quiet and sharp. Morgan emerged from the darkness as if summoned by their despair. He wasn't smiling. He looked at the letter in Liam's hand. "That looks like a hard one, lad," he said. I can't read it," he whispered, the admission costing him his last ounce of pride. "It's from home." Morgan's fiery eyes softened. He gently took the letter from Liam's hand. He angled it toward the distant, flickering gaslight, his expression grim. "It's from a neighbor, it seems, a Mrs. Kate Finnegan." Morgan began to read. His voice was soft, but every word fell on Liam like a hammer blow. "Liam, I write to you with a heavy heart, as the priest is away in Dublin. It is my sorrowful duty to inform you that your father, Eamon, passed into God's hands a fortnight ago. The consumption took him in his sleep. I found him. He heard the words, but his mind refused to accept them. He just stared at Morgan's mouth, watching it form the sounds. Passed. Consumption. Found him. His father was dead. He had died alone in that cold cottage, while Liam was a world away hauling steel. The ring he had sold, the passage he had taken, the money he hadn't yet sent, all of it was useless. No, he was sick, but "There's more, lad," Morgan said, his voice tightening. "With your father gone, God rest his soul, Mr. Thornton, the agent, wasted no time. The cottage is forfeit to Lord Ashworth. They came with the constables." "Anya," Liam gasped, grabbing Morgan's arm. "What does it say about Anya?" Morgan's eyes met his, and Liam saw a world of pity in them. He read the next line. "As she has no family to take her, the parish has taken custody. She has been remanded. She has been sent to the workhouse in Kilkenny." The word struck Liam with the force of a physical impact. The workhouse. He knew the workhouse. Every Irishman did. It was not a place of charity. It was a prison for the poor. It was a place of starvation, of disease, of families torn apart, of children forced into brutal labor. It was a place people went to die, slowly and without dignity. He pictured his small, frail sister, the girl he had vowed to protect, her pale face and thin arms, alone in that place. The iron in his soul, the resolve that had carried him across an ocean, that had driven him into the slag pit and held him up in the rail yard, shattered. It dissolved into a cold, black, bottomless grief. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He slid down the side of the steel rails and sat in the icy mud, his head in his hands. A terrible, dry, racking sob tore through him, a sound of such profound despair that Joseph, Pavel, and Stock took a half-step back as if from a wound. He had failed. He had left them. He had abandoned his father to a lonely death and condemned his sister to a living hell. The weight of his choice, the cost of his chance, was unbearable.
He felt a tear roll down his cheek. It was hot, but it was black. It was a tear of grief and guilt, stained by the soot of the mill that was ingrained in his very skin. It dripped. The tear fell from his chin onto the letter in his lap. The black drop hit the cheap paper, smudging the ink, blurring the words that had just destroyed his world. A letter stained with tears. His tears. Joseph put a massive, calloused hand on Liam's shoulder. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Liam sat there for a long minute, the snow falling on his bent head. Then a new feeling began to creep in, cold and sharp beneath the grief. It was rage, a white-hot, silent rage that burned hotter than any Bessemer converter, a rage at Thornton, a rage at Ashworth, a rage at Flannery, a rage at a world that let this happen. He stood up, his movements stiff. He wiped the black tears from his face, leaving gray streaks on his skin. He carefully, almost tenderly, folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He looked at Morgan, his eyes no longer hollow, but burning with a new, terrifying light. "The workhouse," Liam whispered, the words like chips of ice. "They put her in the workhouse." He took a deep, shuddering breath of the sulphurous air. He said, "This union, tell me more. Tell me how we fight back."
The day the furnaces went cold. Anya's name was a prayer and a curse. It was the name he whispered into the frozen, sulphurous air of the rail yard. It was the name that burned in his heart, a cold fire that the mill's heat could not touch. The letter, stained with his own black tears, was a permanent weight in his pocket. It was no longer a message of grief. It was a declaration of war. Liam O'Connor, the man, had been forged in the slag pit. But Liam O'Connor, the leader, was born in that dark rail yard, his soul baptized in the news of a workhouse. He found Morgan the next night. The Welshman was waiting in the shadows, as he knew he would be. "You're ready," Morgan said. It wasn't a question. He saw the new, hard light in Liam's eyes, a look that had replaced the haunted grief. "I'm ready," Liam said, his voice a low rasp. "But my crew, they're terrified. Pavel and Stock, they have families here. They fear the blacklist." "And they should," Morgan said, his voice grim. "The blacklist is a death sentence. To ask them to risk it, you need more than anger. You need a spark." The spark came 2 days later. It wasn't a man or an accident. It was a piece of paper nailed to the company gate by Flannery himself. It was a notice of a pay cut.
Due to unfavorable market conditions, the bidding war they had all been bleeding for, the company was reducing the wage for all unskilled labor by 10%, effective immediately. The news ripped through the mill like a shock wave. It was a universal blow, hitting every man in every crew. The small 5-cent bonuses were eliminated. The fragile, brutal ecosystem of competition that Flannery had built collapsed in an instant. At the 6 a.m. shape-up, the air was not just cold, it was hostile. The men, Irish, Slav, German, black, all stared at the notice, their faces a mask of disbelief and simmering rage. Scanlon, the boss of the rival Irish crew, tore his cap from his head and threw it into the mud. 10%! He takes 10%! That's the food from my children's mouth! That bastard! Flannery strutted out, his hickory stick tapping. He looked at the assembled men with a smirk. Got a problem, Scanlon? You don't like the pay? There's 100 greenhorns on the boat behind you, happy to take it. We've got a bid to win, boys. Now get to work. He pointed his stick. Scanlon's crew, pit 1. Yosef's crew. Oh, wait, you're still in the dark, ain't you? Back to the yard. No one moved. The silence was a new, dangerous sound. It was heavier than the steam hammers. Flannery's smirk faltered. Did you hear me? I said, move. Liam, standing at the back of the crowd, stepped forward. He walked past Scanlon, past the other crews, until he was standing directly in front of the foreman. The yard fell so quiet that Liam could hear the hiss of the high-pressure steam from the rolling mill. No, Liam said. Flannery's face went white, then a deep, mottled red. What did you say to me? You heard him, Scanlon said, stepping up to stand beside Liam. Then Yosef, who was supposed to be on the night shift but had stayed, moved to Liam's other side. His massive arms were crossed. He just stared at the foreman, a silent mountain of a man. We don't work, Liam said, his voice clear and carrying over the silent yard. You're fired, O'Connor. You're all fired. Get out! Get out of this mill! Then we'll go, Liam said. He turned his back on the foreman. He nodded to Yosef. He looked at Scanlon. He began to walk, not running, toward the main gate. For a second, the crowd hesitated. This was the moment. This was the cliff's edge. To walk out now was to become an outlaw. Then Yosef turned. Pavel and Stock, their fear finally overcome by a greater loyalty, fell in behind him. Then Scanlon, with a roar of, "To hell with him, boys," turned his crew. It was not a rout, it was a procession. 200 men, then 300, as men from the rail sheds and the boiler rooms joined them. They turned their backs on the foreman, on the mill, and walked out into the gray, smoky morning. Morgan was waiting outside the gates, his face alive. "The night shift, are they with us?" Liam looked at Yosef. Yosef nodded, and for the first time, Liam saw him smile. It was a grim, fierce expression. "Night shift, stay," Yosef said. The foreman and the others were screaming, scrambling to get the scabs and the yard bulls, but it was too late. The day shift was outside, and the night shift was inside. The whistle for the shift change blew, but no one moved. The men on the night turn simply stepped back from their stations. They banked their fires. They cooled their tools. They sat down. The mill, for the first time in its history, was being choked from both ends. Liam, Morgan, and the others stood outside the gate, a silent, defiant wall. Inside, the yard bulls tried to force the night crew to work, but the men simply shook their heads. There were too many of them to arrest, too few scabs to replace them. Then the sound began to change. It was the sound that had been the rhythm of Liam's life, the constant thunderous heartbeat of the mill. First, the high-pitched scream of the rolling mill died as the steel cooled. Then the rhythmic, earth-shaking dum, dum, dum of the great steam hammers faltered and stopped. The silence spread, a cooled wave moving through the valley. Liam looked up at the smokestacks. They were the giants of his nightmares, the pillars of the smoky sky. He watched, his breath held. The thick, greasy black smoke that poured from them thinned. It turned from black to a dirty gray. Then it became a pale, white wisp of steam, and then it stopped. One by one, the smokestacks went dark. The air for the first time cleared. Liam could see the hard, winter-blue sky above. The roar was gone. The only sound was the wind whistling through the cold iron skeletons of the sheds. A terrible, profound silence settled over the entire valley. It was the loudest sound Liam had ever heard. "My God," Morgan whispered, taking off his cap as if in church. "You did it, lads. You did it." The beast was dead. The heart had stopped. The day the furnaces went cold had finally come.
A family divided. The silence of the cold furnaces was a fragile, terrifying thing. In the first hours of the strike, the men were euphoric. They had faced the beast, and for a single glorious morning they had won. They stood outside the gates, a defiant mass, watching the yard bulls patrol nervously on the other side. They had cut the mill's heart. But as the cold, smokeless day dragged on, euphoria gave way to a gnawing anxiety. The silence didn't just mean victory. It meant no work. No work meant no pay. And no pay meant starvation. Liam, standing on an overturned wagon with Morgan and Joseph, became the focal point. He had not asked to be a leader, but he had become one. He was the one who had said no. He was the one who had united the Irish and the Slavs. His face, streaked with the grime of the rail yard, was the face of their defiance. "They'll try to wait us out," Morgan shouted, his voice hoarse but clear. "They think our bellies will do their dirty work for them. They think we'll break." "We won't break," a man yelled back, but his voice wavered. "We need to hold the line," Liam added, his own voice surprising him with its strength. "We hold it for Finn's leg. We hold it for the 10% they stole from us. We hold it for every man who's been crushed, burned, or buried in this yard." His words put fire in their hearts, but fire couldn't fill a stomach. As evening fell, the crowd began to disperse, the men drifting back to their tenements, to their families, to the cold reality of what they had done. Liam's rented room in the garret was cold. The landlady, a gaunt woman who had seen a dozen strikes broken, looked at him with pity, not anger. "The grocer on the corner has cut off all credit to the mill families, Mr. O'Connor," she said quietly. "The butcher's done the same." The company's first shot had been fired, not with bullets, but with hunger. Liam knew he had to face his cousin. He walked through the darkening, smoke-free streets of Strikers' Row. The mood was tense. Doors were shut. In some houses there was angry shouting. In others, a fearful silence. The community, which had been united by shared labor, was now being torn apart by the lack of it. He climbed the familiar rickety stairs to Seamus's room. He knocked. Mary opened the door. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes red from weeping. When she saw Liam, her expression was not welcoming. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear. "She's here," she whispered into the room, stepping back. Seamus was sitting at the table, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey in front of him. He was one of the night shift men who had sat down, but Liam could see now that he had been a follower, not a believer.
He was a man trapped by the actions of others. "So, the great general comes to visit," he slurred, not looking up. "Come to see the casualties of your grand war." "Seamus," Liam said quietly, "we had no choice. They cut the pay." "We had a choice," he roared, slamming his fist on the table. The bottle jumped. "We had the choice to take the cut and feed our families. 10% less is a hell of a lot more than nothing." "For how long?" Liam shot back, his own anger rising. "It's 10% today. It's another 10% next month. They'll keep cutting until we're bleeding in the dirt. When do we stop them? When they're burying your children?" Seamus stood up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. He crossed the room and grabbed the front of Liam's coat, shoving him against the wall. His face was inches from Liam's, his breath hot with whiskey and despair. "Don't you talk about my children," he hissed, his voice shaking with rage. "You, a single man, you've got no one. You risked nothing. I've got a wife. I've got 2 boys who were coughing all night. I have rent to pay. You and your Welsh devil and your giant hunky friend, you've starved us all for your own damned pride." "Pride?" Liam grabbed Seamus's wrists, his own strength easily matching his cousin's. "You think this is pride?" "I got a letter, Seamus, from home." The anger in Seamus's eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. What letter?" "Da is dead." The words hung in the tiny cold room. Mary let out a small strangled gasp and put her hand to her mouth. "Consumption," Liam continued, his voice flat and dead, his grip on Seamus's wrists tightening. "He died alone, and because he was gone, Thornton put Anya in the Kilkenny workhouse." Seamus' hands went limp. He stepped back, his face ashen. "The workhouse! Mother of God, Liam!" "That's what this is for." Liam's voice was raw, breaking with the grief he hadn't allowed himself to feel. "It's not for pride. It's for her. It's for a world where they can't just take a child and throw her away to die because her family's poor. It's for a world where they can't cut a man's leg off and replace him in the same breath. I am not risking nothing. I am fighting for the only thing I have left." For a long moment, the 2 cousins stared at each other, the chasm between them vast and absolute. Liam saw a man he barely recognized, a man broken by fear. Seamus saw a stranger, a zealot who was willing to burn down the world and his family with it. "I'm sorry, Liam," Seamus whispered, his voice cracking. "For your father, for the girl. It's a terrible thing." He picked up his chair and sat back down. He poured another drink, his hand shaking. "But it changes nothing," he said, staring into the cup. "Your fight, it won't save her. It will just kill us." "Seamus," Mary pleaded. "No, Mary. He needs to know. The grocer cut us off. I have 2 days of food, 2 days, and then what? Do I tell my boys to eat their cousin's solidarity?" He looked up, his eyes cold and hard. "You are not family, Liam. Not anymore. You've made your choice. You chose the hunkies in the union. You've divided us. You've divided this whole street. Get out." "Seamus," Mary cried, openly weeping now. "I said, get out," Seamus roared. "Get out of my home, and don't come back." Liam stood in the doorway, the cold draft from the stairwell wrapping around him. He looked at Mary's terrified, tear-streaked face. He looked at Seamus, his own blood, who now looked at him with the eyes of an enemy. The family he had left in Ireland was dead or imprisoned. The family he had crossed an ocean to find had just cast him out. He turned and walked down the stairs, each step heavy. He was truly, finally alone. As he stepped out into the dark, smokeless street, he knew the strike was no longer just a fight against the company. It was a fight against his own past, against the fear that was poisoning his own people. He walked toward the river, where he knew Morgan was organizing a picket line. His heart was a cold, hard piece of iron. His family was divided. His only brothers now were the men who stood with him in the dark.
The price of loyalty. The strike was a week old. The silence that had once been a victory now felt like a funeral. The smoke-free sky, which had at first seemed a miracle, was now just a cold, empty blue that offered no warmth. Hunger had set in. Strikers' Row was a neighborhood under siege, not by an army, but by its own desperation. The company's strategy was brutally effective. With all credit cut off, the small reserves of food in every tenement dwindled to nothing. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder at the gate now looked at each other with suspicion. How much food did he have? Was he thinking of breaking? Liam lived on the picket line. He barely slept, existing on stale bread donated by a sympathetic baker and bitter, boiled chicory coffee from the union's makeshift soup kitchen. He, Morgan, and Yosef were the unshakable pillars of the strike. They patrolled the gates, their faces gaunt, their eyes burning with a mixture of fatigue and zeal. They moved from group to group, stamping their feet against the cold, their voices hoarse as they kept the men's spirits up. "Hold the line, boys," Morgan would call out, his Welsh lilt undiminished. "They're hurting. We hear it from the railroad men. They've got contracts backed up to Philadelphia. Every day we stand here, it costs them a fortune." But a company's fortune felt abstract. A child's cry from hunger was not. Liam felt the isolation of his leadership keenly. Since Seamus had thrown him out, he had no home. His family was now Yosef, Pavel, and Stack, who shared their meager rations with him without a word. His loyalty was no longer to a person or a place, but to an idea. It was a cold comfort. The price of that loyalty was tested on the 8th day. The company made its move. Just after dawn, 2 heavy wagons, their canvases tied down, rumbled up the main road. They were not alone. Flanking them, on horseback and on foot, were a dozen men in dark suits, their coats unbuttoned to show the pistols and clubs at their belts. They were unmistakable. "Pinkertons," Morgan spat, the name like a curse. "So the hired guns arrive." The strikers who had been huddled around small fires surged to their feet. A low growl rose from the crowd. They formed a human wall in front of the main gate, blocking the road. Liam, Yosef, and Scanlon were at the front. "Hold the line, boys," Liam roared, his voice cracking in the cold. "Don't let them in. This is our gate." The wagons stopped. The Pinkerton leader, a man with a cold, scarred face, dismounted. "We have a work order," he said, his voice flat. "We're escorting these men to their jobs. Stand aside or you will be removed." "This is a legal strike," Yosef yelled. "This is company property, and these are company men." He gestured to the wagons. "Last chance. Move." "No one crosses," Scanlon shouted, picking up a loose cobblestone. "No violence," Liam ordered, putting a hand on Scanlon's arm. "We just stand. We don't move." The Pinkerton sneered. He nodded to his men, who drew their clubs. "Clear the way." As the Pinkertons advanced, one of them went to the back of the first wagon and untied the canvas flap. "All right, boys, time to work." A group of men, 4 or 5 in total, climbed out. They were pale, terrified-looking men Liam didn't recognize, likely brought in from another city. They were the first scabs. The crowd erupted, screaming, "Traitor! Scab! Starver!" The strikers surged, and the picket line broke into a melee. Pinkertons waded in, their clubs rising and falling. Men shouted and fell. Liam was in the thick of it, trying to push a Pinkerton away from Pavel, when he saw the second wagon.
A man was climbing out, his face hidden by the shadow of his cap, his collar pulled high. He was trying to slip past the brawl, his eyes fixed on the mill gate, as if it were a sanctuary. He moved with a familiar, desperate haste. Yosef, standing beside Liam, saw him too. He grunted, "Look!" Liam's heart stopped. The world seemed to narrow, the sounds of the riot fading to a dull roar. He knew that walk. He knew that coat. "Seamus!" he whispered. He broke free from the fight and ran not toward the man, but in front of him, blocking his path to the gate. "Seamus!" he yelled. His cousin froze. He slowly lowered his collar. It was him. His face was a hollow-eyed mask of desperation and shame. His eyes were not angry. They were dead. "Get out of the way, Liam," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I can't," Liam pleaded, grabbing his cousin's arm. The brawl was still raging a few yards away. "You can't do this! You'll be a scab, a traitor! They'll never let you forget this!" "My children haven't eaten in 2 days," Samish said. "My boy, my youngest, he's got a fever, and I can't even buy him broth. Do you understand? He is starving. Your fight won't feed him. But this," he nodded toward the gate, where Flannery was now standing, watching. "This will. We're holding, Samish. We're going to win. Just one more day." "I don't have one more day," Samish roared, his desperation breaking into rage. He tore his arm from Liam's grasp. "You did this! You! With your talk of unions and your damned revenge! You've killed us! You've killed my family!" Scanlon, his lips split and bleeding, saw them, his face contorted with a pure, undiluted hatred. "A scab! O'Connor's own cousin! A bloody traitor!" Scanlon and 2 other strikers lunged at Samish. "We'll teach you, you bastard!" This was the price. Liam's choice was now absolute, and it had to be made in a fraction of a second. His loyalty to the strike, to the union, to the men bleeding beside him, demanded he let them tear Samish apart. It was the law of the picket line. His loyalty to the memory of his family, to the hollowed, terrified eyes of his cousin, demanded something else. As Scanlon swung, Liam didn't hesitate. He stepped between them, shoving Scanlon back so hard the man tripped and fell. "No!" Liam bellowed, his voice a raw command. The brawl around them quieted. Strikers and Pinkertons alike turned to look. Liam was standing with his back to his cousin, his arms spread, protecting the scab from the strikers. Scanlon stared at him, betrayed. "Liam, in what God's name are you doing? He's a scab!" "He's my blood," Liam said, his voice shaking. But as he said it, he looked over his shoulder at Samish, who was cowering against the wagon. The man he saw was not his blood. He was a stranger, a coward. The blood tie he felt was a phantom, a ghost of a life that was dead and gone. He realized his mistake. He wasn't protecting Samish. He was just ending it. He turned back to Scanlon, his face hardening, the fire in his eyes dying and leaving only cold ash. He said, "He's not worth it. He's not worth a broken hand. He's nothing." He lowered his arms and stepped aside. The path was clear. Samish looked at Liam, his eyes wide, expecting another blow. But Liam just stared through him, his gaze as cold and empty as the smokeless sky. Samish scrambled past him, past the silent, hateful stares of the strikers, and ran through the mill gate. Flannery put a possessive hand on his shoulder and sneered at Liam before guiding Seamus inside. The price of loyalty had been paid. In that moment, by protecting his cousin for 1 second and disowning him in the next, he had lost everything. He had betrayed the strikers by interfering, and he had betrayed his family by letting him go. Scanlon spat on the ground where Seamus had stood. "He's your blood, O'Connor, and he's a rat. What does that make you?" Liam didn't answer. He just turned back to the picket line, his back straight. The Pinkertons had gotten their scabs in. The line was broken, and his family was gone forever. He felt Joseph's massive hand on his shoulder. The big man said nothing. He just squeezed, a gesture of shared, silent understanding. Liam's loyalty to the stripe had cost him his last tie to his old life. He was no longer a cousin, a son, or a brother. He was just a Union man. And he never felt so alone.
The stand at Harper's Gate. The strike was not just broken, it was shattered. The sight of Seamus crossing the line, protected by the very men who were there to beat them, had drained the last bit of resolve from the strikers. It was a deeply personal betrayal that cut deeper than any club. A thin, dirty plume of smoke now rose from one of the mill's stacks. It was a sign of life, a taunt. Flannery, having gotten his first wedge of scabs in, was working them around the clock, protected by the Pinkertons. Every day, a few more desperate, hungry strikers would abandon the picket line, their heads bowed in shame, and follow Seamus's path to the gate, begging for their old jobs back. Liam, Joseph, and Morgan watched their movement die by inches. The soup kitchen was now just a pot of hot, dirty water. The men who remained on the line were the most desperate, the most furious, and the most loyal, a dangerous combination. Scanlon and his crew were among them, their faces thin and wolf-like, their anger directed at everyone, the company, the Pinkertons, and, in quiet, resentful glances, at Liam himself. His moment of hesitation with his cousin had been noted. "It's over, lads," Morgan said, his voice a low rasp. "They've broken us. The best we can do now is scatter before they arrest us all for vagrancy." "No," Liam said. The word was flat, dead. Joseph, who had been silent, shook his head. "Niet, not over." "Liam, listen to me," Morgan urged, his usual fire gone. "There's a train arriving at dawn, 50 more scabs from Chicago. The company's bringing them straight here. The line is gone. There's nothing we can do." "We can stand," Liam said. He looked at the main entrance to the mill. Its official name was the Monongahela Works, but the men had always called it Harper's Gate, after the long-dead ironmaster who had built it. It was a massive arch of brick and iron, wide enough for 2 wagons. "We can stand there." "Stand? Liam, they'll walk right over us." "Let them," Liam said. He was no longer thinking about winning. He was no longer thinking about wages or hours. He was thinking of Anya in the workhouse, of his father dead, of Seamus's betrayal, of Finn's leg. He was thinking of the price he had paid. If he was to be defeated, he would not be defeated in a cold alley. He would be defeated at the gate. "One last time," he said, his voice finding a strength he didn't know he had. "We don't just picket. We block the gate. We make them move us." He looked at Joseph. The big man nodded once, a solemn vow. The word spread through the remaining strikers like a cold fire. It was not a call to victory. It was a call to an honorable end. At 4 in the morning, under a black, starless sky, they moved. It was not a picket line. It was a barricade. They dragged what they could, overturned carts from the street, barrels from the tannery, scrap lumber and sections of discarded rail. They built a crude, shoulder-high wall of debris sealing the entire 20-foot span of Harper's Gate. And then, about 50 men, all that was left of the strike, stood behind it. They were armed with pry bars, broken bricks, and the handles of their own tools. Liam, Joseph, and Scanlon stood at the center, on top of an overturned wagon. They watched the sun rise, the gray light revealing their desperate, pathetic fortress. At 6 a.m., they heard the sound, the rhythmic, disciplined tramp of marching feet.
The Pinkertons came first, 30 of them, in a wedge formation. They were no longer just carrying clubs, many now carried repeating rifles. Behind them, huddled together, was the column of new scabs, their faces pale with fear. And at the very front, walking with the confidence of a conquering general, was the scarred Pinkerton leader. He stopped 10 yards from the barricade, his eyes taking in the scene with a look of bored contempt. "Well, boys," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you've been busy." I unbuttoned his coat. "This is your last and final warning from the company. Disperse this mess and go home, or you will be dispersed." "No one crosses," Liam roared, his voice echoing in the unnaturally quiet yard. "This mill is closed." The Pinkerton leader sighed. "Flannery," he called back toward the gate. Flannery himself appeared on the inside of the gate, climbing up to stand on the wall. He looked down on the strikers like a feudal lord. Beside him, clutching a hammer, was Seamus, his face a mask of terror. "Flannery, tell your dogs to stand down," Scanlon shrieked, his hatred making his voice crack. "They're not my dogs, Scanlon," Flannery sneered. "They're vagrants, trespassers. This is private property." He looked at Liam, his eyes full of triumphant malice. "Clear them out." The Pinkerton leader drew his pistol. "Men, clear the way." He fired a single shot into the air. The scabs behind him whimpered. The Pinkertons advanced. They did not run. They walked, a disciplined, black-clad line. They hit the barricade and began to tear it apart. The strikers roared, a sound of pure, suicidal rage. The battle for Harker's Gate began. It was a slaughter. The Pinkertons were professionals, fresh and well-fed, armed with hickory and steel. The strikers were starved, exhausted, and fighting with scraps. A club would rise and fall, and a man would go down, his skull cracked. But the strikers fought with a terrible, animalistic fury. They were not fighting for their jobs anymore. They were fighting for their very existence. Joseph was a giant at the center of the line. He grabbed the barricade's main timber, a heavy oak beam, and used it as a battering ram, sweeping 2 Pinkertons off their feet. He roared, a deep, guttural sound as they swarmed him. Scanlon fought like a cornered wolf, a broken bottle in his hand, slashing and stabbing. Liam found himself face to face with the Pinkerton leader. His man was fast, his club a blur. He feinted high and struck Liam hard in the ribs, the sound a dull thump. Liam staggered, gasping, the pain blinding. He raised his club for a final finishing blow. A brick smashed into the side of the Pinkerton's head. He stumbled, stunned. Morgan, the Welshman, stood behind him, another brick in hand. "On your feet, boy. This ain't over." But it was. The line was breaking. The barricade was being torn apart. Then, from behind the gate, a new sound. Gunfire. Flannery, safe on his perch, had a revolver. He was firing down into the melee. "Get them! Get them all!" he screamed, drunk with power. A striker near Liam clutched his chest and fell. The striker's rage turned to panic. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Joseph, seeing the gun, roared and tried to climb the barricade to get at Flannery. "Joseph, no!" Liam yelled. A Pinkerton on the ground leveled his pistol at the massive exposed target. He took careful aim at Joseph's back. Liam saw it all in a flash of terrible clarity. The gunman, the upraised pistol, Joseph's broad back, and on the wall, Seamus, watching, his face white, paralyzed with fear. Liam didn't think. He ran. He threw himself forward, shoving Joseph hard in the side, spinning the big man off the barricade. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He looked down. There was a small, dark hole in his chest. He felt no pain, just a sudden, vast, and surprising cold. He heard a distant yelling. It might have been his own name. He fell to his knees, his gaze fixed on the gate. He saw Flannery, his face a mask of shock, lowering his pistol. He saw Seamus, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes locked on Liam's. Then the world went gray, and he pitched forward into the mud. The stand was over. The sound of the shot and the sight of Liam falling broke the last of the strikers. They fled, scattering into the alleys, hounded by the Pinkertons. Joseph roared, a sound of pure, inhuman grief. He turned back, ignoring the clubs, and scooped Liam's limp body into his arms. He charged, not at the mill, but through the Pinkerton line, scattering them like bowling pins, and disappeared down the street, carrying his fallen friend. The Pinkertons kicked the last of the barricade aside. The scarred leader, his head bleeding, holstered his pistol. "All right," he grunted, gesturing to the terrified scabs. "Path is clear. Get to work."
The new men, stepping over the blood and broken clubs, filed into the mill. Harper's Gate was open. The furnaces, fed with new men, roared back to life, their smoke once again blotting out the sun. A different kind of dawn. The first thing he knew was pain. It was not the searing heat of the slag pit or the aching cold of the rail yard. It was a deep, sharp, contained fire in his chest. The second thing he knew was silence, a thick, muffled quiet, not the silence of the cold furnaces, but the stillness of a small, warm room. He opened his eyes. The light was not the gray, greasy light of Stryker's Row, filtered through smog. It was a clean, yellow lamplight. He was on a narrow cot under a thick quilt. He tried to move, and a white-hot spike of agony lanced through his side, forcing a gasp from his lips. "Easy, son. You'll tear the stitches." A man with steel-rimmed spectacles and a kind, tired face leaned over him. He was old, with white hair, and he smelled of carbolic soap. Where? Liam's voice was a dry croak. "You're in my cellar. My name is Dr. Ehrenthal. You've been here for 3 days. You are, against all medical reason, alive. The bullet missed your heart by an inch. It did, however, pass cleanly through." The gate," Liam whispered, the memory rushing back in a wave of pain and smoke. "Joseph!" As if summoned, the massive, dark shape of Joseph emerged from the shadows in the corner. He had been sitting there, silent, the entire time. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was whole. He stepped to the cot and looked down at Liam. His expression, usually so stoic, was one of profound, bone-deep relief. They broke," Joseph said, his voice a low rumble. "Strike is gone. Mill, she works." Liam closed his eyes. So it was all for nothing. The stand, the barricade, the shot. He had failed. He had been defeated. "You are a wanted man, Mr. O'Connor," the doctor said gently, wiping Liam's forehead with a damp cloth. "You've been branded an agitator, an inciter of riot. The Pinkertons have your name. If you are found, you will be in a cell before your wound is healed." "Joseph?" Liam whispered. "Hunky," Joseph said, with a shrug that must have pained his bruised body. "They do not know my name. They do not care. I am back in slag pit." The terrible, bitter irony of it all settled on Liam. Joseph, who had stood with him, was invisible. He was just a hunky, interchangeable, his loyalty and his defiance unrecorded. He had saved Liam's life, and as a reward was allowed to return to the furnace. Liam,
The Irishman, the one who could speak, was the one they remembered. He was the one they wanted to punish. He spent 2 weeks in that cellar, a prisoner of his own recovery. Dr. Aehrenthal, a German immigrant who had seen the industry devour men in his own homeland, tended to him with a quiet paternal care. Joseph, after his own grueling 12-hour shifts, would appear with scraps of food, a piece of bread, a hard-boiled egg, and sit vigil, a silent, unmovable guardian. The world outside filtered in through their words. The strike was a bitter memory. The men were back at work, under the old wages, the 10% cut now permanent. Flannery was a tyrant, emboldened by his victory. The Pinkertons were gone, their job done. And Seamus. "Your cousin," the doctor said, one night changing Liam's bandage. "He works. I see him. He is a ghost. The company protects him, but the neighborhood, they do not speak his name. His wife, Mary, she does not leave her room. The price of his survival, I think, is everything else." Liam healed. The fire in his chest dulled to a constant pulling ache, a reminder of the price he had paid for a loyalty he wasn't even sure he understood. With his returning strength came a profound, hollow emptiness. His father was dead. His sister was in a workhouse, 1,000 miles and an ocean of impossibility away. His family was broken. His strike had failed. His own people saw him as a fool or a traitor. He had nothing. On the last night, Morgan appeared. He slipped into the cellar like a wisp of the smog he so resembled. He was thinner, his coat in rags, but his eyes still held their fire. "I'm blacklisted, of course. Can't get a day's work from here to Chicago. I'm heading west, Colorado. They're digging for silver. Where there's digging, there's men. And where there's men, there's a fight." He clapped Liam on his good shoulder. "You're a legend, O'Connor, the man who took a bullet at the gate." "It was for nothing, Morgan. We lost. They're working. Nothing's changed." "Nothing's changed!" Morgan leaned in, his voice a fierce hiss. "You're wrong, lad. Everything has changed. They saw you. They saw an Irishman, a Paddy, get shot protecting a hunkie. They saw a man stand up to Flannery. They saw the furnaces go cold for 11 days. He tapped his own temple. "You lost the battle, aye, but the idea is in their heads now. It's a seed, Liam. It's in the dark, under all that slag and soot, and it's growing. They can't dig it out, they can't shoot it, and one day it'll break this whole damned city open." He pressed a small, worn book in Liam's hand. "You're a leader, boy, but you can't lead with your back. You need the words." He grasped Liam's hand, his grip like steel. "Don't let them beat you. Live and learn." He was gone. The next morning, before the sun was up, Liam put on a set of worn, clean clothes the doctor had given him. He shook the old man's hand, a debt he could never repay. He clasped Joseph's arm, a bond that needed no words. He stepped out of the cellar. The air was cold, sharp, and, as always, thick with sulfur. He was a fugitive. He couldn't go home. He couldn't work. He couldn't even walk the streets in daylight. He moved through the pre-dawn shadows. The city was stirring. The mill's whistle shrieked, the call to another day of labor. He saw a river of men, dark shapes in the gloom, shuffling toward the gate. Then he saw him. Seamus was walking away from the mill, part of the exhausted night turn. Their paths crossed at a muddy intersection. For a second, they just stood, 6 feet apart. Seamus looked ancient. His face was a hollow mask of soot and shame, his eyes dead. He had won. He had his job. He was feeding his family. And in doing so, he had lost his soul. He looked at Liam, at his cousin, alive, and his face crumpled. It was not hatred. It was a terrible, agonizing envy. He flinched, as if expecting a blow, and hurried away, disappearing into the dark alley of his own life. Liam watched him go, and felt nothing. No anger, no grief, just a vast, cold emptiness. The final thread to his past was severed. He turned his back to the mill. He walked away from Stryker's Row, away from the river, away from the life of steel. He walked until he found a quiet street, a small, unassuming shop with a sign in the window, K. Baumgarten, printer. This was the man Morgan had told him about. He clutched the small book Morgan had given him. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the one he still couldn't read himself, the one stained with his own tears. Anya's face was in his mind, a small, pale ghost. He was a man with no family, no trade, and no home. But as the first dirty red light of the Pittsburgh morning broke over the smog-choked ridges, he felt a new kind of resolve. It was not the hot iron of rage. It was the cold, patient, unbending steel of purpose. He would not be a mule. He would not be a strong back. He would be the words. He would be the whisper. He would learn to read, to write, to think. He would be the man who wrote the pamphlets, the one who gave the others the idea. The sun rose over the furnaces, a familiar, fiery dawn. But for Liam O'Connor, as he stood at the printer's door, it was a different kind of dawn. The battle was lost. The war had just begun.